It was just an ordinary night, nothing special. The entire mansion was quiet, with the exception of one room. In a spacious hall, a young couple, a brown-haired man and a pink-haired girl, were being intimate. The sounds coming from the slightly ajar door made it clear that they were thoroughly enjoying each other's company. A girl who was passing by the hall at that moment heard the sounds and immediately covered her mouth, hoping not to be discovered. In shock, she felt her knees, fighting back tears. An image flashed before her eyes. She was in a beautiful wedding dress, with a young blonde man standing beside her. However, she understood that right now, behind that door, her husband was cheating on her. Meanwhile, 10 hours earlier, the mansion was bustling with preparations for a celebration. Rihanna was also getting ready to go out, trying on exquisite jewelry. Once the girl was ready, she went to her maids, who told her that all the preparations for the celebration were complete. Rihanna murmured to herself that she and her husband had been together for 5 years, so everything had to be perfect. Then, a maid asked where the master himself was, as he hadn't been seen for a long time. The girl offered to find her husband herself, and instructed the others to double-check all the preparations. Soon, she arrived at her husband's office, but he wasn't there. The girl paced around the room, wondering where he could have gone. Suddenly, she saw a box on his desk. When Rihanna opened it, she saw a beautiful black necklace inside with a huge gemstone set in the middle. Seeing such a beautiful peridot ornament, the girl gasped in surprise, thinking that her husband had excellent taste indeed. For the past few days, she had felt a distance between them because she had been busy with the festival preparations. So, the girl decided to close the box and pretend she hadn't seen anything. The celebration began soon after, and guests poured into the mansion. Rihanna scanned the room, trying to find her husband in the crowd. She finally saw him talking with several men. As she approached, she was a little surprised that he had been here all along. He leaned down to greet her and then planted a sweet kiss on her forehead. Rihanna blushed, smiled, and gently touched the spot he had kissed. Just then, a guest, Mrs. McCarthy, came over to congratulate them on their 5th anniversary and mentioned that she had prepared a small gift for her. The lady handed over a small box, hoping she would like it. Rihanna opened the box and saw a beautiful necklace with reddish-pink gemstones, thinking to herself that her husband, George, had also prepared a necklace for her. Mrs. McCarthy looked surprised and asked if she didn't like the gift. But Rihanna quickly reassured her, saying the piece of jewelry was incredibly beautiful. Then, the guest suggested she try it on right away. A maid helped the girl put on the necklace, although she didn't really want to, as she hadn't planned on wearing anything special today, considering George's gift. But when the jewelry was on her neck, the surrounding guests showered her with compliments, saying it looked as if it were made for her. Afterwards, Rihanna went back to find her husband, who was once again busy mingling with the guests. Next, the girl asked where Elizabeth was, and a maid guessed she would arrive shortly. Rihanna hoped that Lizzie, her beloved little sister, could be by her side on such a wonderful day. Soon, a young girl with long pink hair and green eyes arrived in the hall, wearing a chic black and pink dress. As soon as she saw her older sister, she rushed forward to hug her. But in that very moment, Rihanna's gaze fell upon her neck, and she saw the necklace she had seen in her husband's study. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, as a fact slowly became clear in her mind. Her husband was having an affair with her twin sister. But Elizabeth acted completely normal, greeting her sister and apologizing for being late. Rihanna didn't return the greeting, simply asking where she got the necklace. Elizabeth just smiled nonchalantly and said it was a gift. Then, Mrs. McCarthy asked if she had a sweetheart, but she said it was a secret, as the star of the evening was her sister. Elizabeth went up to Rihanna and congratulated her on her 5th wedding anniversary. The lady of the manor was a bit flustered, but still thanked her sister for her well wishes. Soon, George also joined the conversation, greeting Elizabeth. The girl also congratulated him on the anniversary, thanking him for taking care of her sister for 5 years. George gently stroked Elizabeth's hair, thanking her for her companionship over the years. Seeing this, Rihanna could barely stand and fell to her knees. Mrs. McCarthy, who was standing nearby, caught her and asked if Lady Royd was all right. George and Elizabeth immediately rushed to the girl's side, wanting to help. But Rihanna just waved them away, saying she was fine and had just not been sleeping well lately. She said she would rest for a bit and would surely be fine. Then, Elizabeth handed over a box with a gift, saying she wanted to take good care of her sister this year. Rihanna wondered, why is she suddenly doing this? Could she be feeling guilty about, the thing with her husband? When the girl opened the box, she saw a peridot brooch and couldn't help but sneer. Elizabeth said it was a part of her gemstone, symbolizing the happiness of a young couple. She asked if George had prepared a gift for his wife, and the man replied that he would give it to her later, advising Elizabeth not to worry too much. The girl just said there was nothing to worry about, as she knew how much George loved his wife. Soon it was evening, and the guests began to leave. Elizabeth praised her sister for doing a great job today and invited her to have dinner together. But Rihanna said she wasn't feeling well and planned to rest. She told Elizabeth she could have dinner with her husband in the mansion. Rihanna knew she needed to think about this calmly, as she had no concrete proof of their affair. She just couldn't believe something like this could happen. She walked towards her husband's study, intending to find the necklace box, but when she got to his desk, the box was gone. Just then, George himself walked into the study and asked Rihanna what she was doing there. She replied that she was waiting for him. The man didn't understand what she wanted from him. Then, the girl remembered what he had said at the party about having a gift for her. She asked if he could give it to her now. George completely froze, not knowing what to say. So he told her that he had ordered a dress for his wife, but it hadn't arrived yet. He explained that it was an overseas order and that they had to wait a while when the seas were rough. George hugged Rihanna, apologizing for not ordering the dress sooner. The girl told him not to worry. She said she had also prepared something for him and planned to show it to him tonight. Rihanna asked if he would come to her bedroom, as it was a special day. But George just took a step back, saying she wasn't feeling well today and that they should talk about it another time. Night fell, and Rihanna lay alone in bed, but she couldn't sleep at all. Then she got out of bed, wondering what George might be doing right now. She walked towards her husband's room, telling herself she was just being paranoid, that he would never cheat on her, especially not with her sister. But when she reached his door and peeked inside through the crack, her worst fears were confirmed. Her husband was spending the night with Elizabeth, her twin sister. He was telling the girl how much he loved her, and Rihanna heard every word. Not wanting to stay a second longer, she returned to her room and sat by her bed until dawn. She knew she had to face the fact that those two were having an affair, but she didn't feel sad. A fire of revenge burned in her eyes as she plotted her next move. They had no children, so if she wanted a divorce, the process wouldn't drag on for too long. But she had no intention of letting him get away with this betrayal so easily. Rihanna was determined to get her revenge, no matter the cost. At breakfast, a maid noticed that the lady of the house was unusually pale. Meanwhile, Rihanna was thinking that she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Vengeance was George's personal servant, and probably 90% of the people in the manor would side with him. They most likely already knew everything and were just hiding it from her. So, Rihanna summoned another maid, Margaret, and asked her to come see her later. The girl didn't understand why her mistress suddenly wanted to see her. The mistress said it was something important. Just then, George walked into the dining room, yawning tiredly, and greeted his wife. He asked how she had slept, and Rihanna replied that last night had been an ordeal. George wondered what the reason was, since he had told her to get some rest last night. Rihanna decided to remain silent, clenching her fists in anger, and then pointed out that her husband was also pale. She added that, by the looks of him, he hadn't gotten much sleep last night either. George just averted his gaze and said he had slept like a log. Just then, Elizabeth entered the room, greeting her sister and Count Royd. The girl said she had slept enough to last her for months. Rihanna simply replied that she hadn't slept nearly as well today. Elizabeth commented that it wasn't surprising seeing her haggard appearance, but then added with a smile that since Rihanna was so eager to meet her nephew, she should eat and sleep well. The girl decided not to answer the question, and the three of them ate breakfast in silence for a while. But soon, Rihanna decided to bring up the topic of the person who gave Elizabeth the necklace. George gasped in alarm. Then Elizabeth asked if her sister was talking about the peridot necklace. Rihanna nodded. The girl then decided to change the subject, saying it would be better to wait until she could introduce the man to her sister in person, just as they had agreed. The mistress thought to herself that she had indeed thought so before she caught the two of them. Then she said that her sister was already 23 and she herself had been married for 5 years. The girl added that for so long, she thought she would be more indifferent to her sister's affairs, but she still understood that it would be a terrible thing if her sister didn't get married. Elizabeth and George listened to Rihanna in silence, not knowing what to say to her. The girl then thanked her sister for her concern, but added that she hadn't considered marriage yet. However, before she could finish, Rihanna firmly told her to bring over the man she was going to marry. Seeing the confusion on her sister's face, The girl asked what exactly she was so carefully avoiding. She added that it seemed like Elizabeth didn't want them to meet him. Then Rihanna turned to her husband and asked for his opinion on the matter, but the man just sneered, trying to avoid answering. At this, Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, reminded her sister of her recent divorce, saying she didn't want to rush into things like that again and get hurt. The girl stood up from the table and apologized for ruining the mood. Then she hurried away. George immediately stood up after her, intending to stop Elizabeth. He turned to his wife and said it was her fault the girl had become like this. Rihanna just watched her husband leave in silence, thinking that her only mistake was meeting them in the first place. Whatever happened next, they would have brought it upon themselves, and she would do everything she could to enjoy watching them fall apart. After breakfast, Rihanna decided to take a bath and then meet with Margaret as planned. The maid couldn't believe that the problem was really an affair between Mr. Royd and Miss Elizabeth. Rihanna said that since it all happened in this house, it was impossible to hide something like this without the servant's involvement. Then the girl gently caressed Margaret's cheek, saying she was the only one she could trust. The maid shed tears, never having expected her mistress to trust her so much. Then Rihanna asked if she could do her a favor. Margaret immediately said she would do anything to help her mistress. Rihanna confirmed again, asking if she was worried about becoming a thorn in Elizabeth's side. The maid said that from her very first day here, she had always been cared for by her mistress, and it would continue to be so. The girl hugged Margaret, saying it was so good to have her by her side. After the mistress came out of her bath, the maid decided to talk to her again, asking if she was considering a divorce. Rihanna replied that she would definitely file for divorce after they were done with George. Then, the girl said she needed Margaret to do something for her. She whispered her request in the maid's ear, and the maid was surprised that her mistress really wanted to do that. Rihanna said that since Elizabeth was getting married, they had no choice but to help her out. Once ready, she walked towards the hall where her father's portrait hung. He had been strongly against Rihanna's engagement to George. The old man said the boy came from the Royd family, which had produced bureaucrats for generations, so it annoyed him that George had yet to secure a position in a government department. He told his daughter that she had to understand that if George achieved nothing after the marriage, they wouldn't be able to interfere. When Rihanna brought her fiancé home, her father didn't express his displeasure to the fellow. Instead, he gave him the opportunity to manage his hotel together with his wife. But now Rihanna understood that her father was right, because George couldn't even repay the trust and respect. She smashed their photo together, saying that divorcing him was just the first step and she would never let him get away with his reckless actions. After that, she left the room, leaving the broken picture frame on the floor. The next day at breakfast, George turned to Rihanna. He said he had planned to tell her later, but had decided to confess something now. The girl tensed up, thinking he was about to admit to his affair. But then George announced that he had gotten the position this time. Rihanna was surprised, wondering if her husband had gone for an interview without telling her. Then he revealed that he had gotten the job through a recommendation. A recommendation from Duke MacDonald. The girl clenched her fists in anger. So her husband had gotten the job through connections. She wasn't even surprised by such blatant incompetence. However, she just smiled and congratulated her husband on his appointment, saying her father would have been happy about it too. George immediately started boasting, saying that now everyone would recognize his abilities and potential, which his father and brothers were unaware of. Elizabeth immediately ran to the man's side, saying they should celebrate with some good wine. All three of them poured wine into their glasses, but Rihanna couldn't feel happy at all. Feeling her husband's hand on her shoulder, she thought, the more he has to lose, the better, because despair will swallow him whole. A short while later, Rihanna headed for the exit. Elizabeth saw her off, wished her a good day at work, and said she was proud of her sister's hard work. Then Rihanna asked if her twin sister was all right, and she replied that she was going to a tea party hosted by Marquise Ezra. The girl told her to be careful and then walked out the door. Elizabeth watched her leave with a somber gaze. As soon as the mistress left the house, the smile vanished from the sister's face. But once she was sure Rihanna had left, she returned inside the mansion, strolling leisurely down the hallway. Soon, she arrived at George's room, and the lovers immediately embraced. Elizabeth quickly reassured the man, saying Rihanna was gone and they had nothing to fear. The next moment, she forcefully pushed George onto the bed, leaned over him, and said that now he could focus only on her. A while later, the couple woke up in the same bed, and she said with a hint of sadness that it was time to go. George begged her to stay a little longer, and although Elizabeth tried to resist, the desire to be with her lover was stronger. Still, she eventually went to the tea party, where the girls were gossiping about that pervert being back in town. Elizabeth didn't know who they were talking about, so they explained that for the past 5 years, a weirdo had been sending strange letters to girls and warned her to be careful. Elizabeth just scoffed, her mind solely focused on going home to see George's face again. When she returned, Rihanna invited her and her husband to sit in the garden with her. She had a question for her sister. Then, Rihanna took out a letter, saying she had found it on her way home yesterday. She guessed it was from the man her sister was seeing. Elizabeth was stunned. She had no idea what Rihanna was talking about. Then Rihanna said she had been restraining her curiosity and hadn't opened the letter. Elizabeth snatched the envelope from her sister's hand, saying it was a private matter. Soon, she returned to her room, closed the door, and made sure no one was around. She couldn't wait to find out who was writing to her. The contents left her dumbfounded. Some anonymous pervert said that Miss Elizabeth Norton looked gorgeous in her purple dress at the last party, that she was driving him crazier by the day, and that tonight he planned to get close to her neck in that necklace. Elizabeth furiously tore the letter to shreds, threw it in the trash, and cursed the madman who dared to write such things to her. Later, when the two sisters met again, Rihanna asked her twin if she was really serious about that man. Elizabeth hesitated and asked why she was so interested. Rihanna was annoyed by the question and said that Margaret had found something very interesting in her room. She showed her sister the pieced together letter, saying that after finding such a filthy message in the trash, it was unthinkable to go and see the man who wrote it. Elizabeth lowered her head and said that at first she also thought it was from him, but it later turned out that all the single ladies of high birth had received similar letters. Rihanna stood up from the table and shouted, not understanding how her twin sister could keep something like this a secret. She grabbed her sister's shoulders, saying the thought of that pervert targeting her was driving her crazy, and then told her she needed to get married as soon as possible. Elizabeth gasped, completely stunned. Rihanna then told her to bring the man home this week, as he needed to know about all this too. But she just said that wouldn't be possible because she had already dumped him. Rihanna was taken aback and asked how her sister was doing after the breakup. Elizabeth looked away and said the guy was just a drop in the ocean. Then Rihanna said that after all this, she would never leave her little sister alone. She announced that she would find a decent man for her, and quickly. Elizabeth and George exchanged a nervous glance, but didn't dare say a word. When the two were alone in a room, she angrily threw a pillow onto the bed. He tried to calm her down, but the lady was furious. How could she possibly stay calm after something like this? Ever since receiving that pervert's letter, Rihanna had been like a broken record, constantly harping on about marriage, her mind set on her sister needing to settle down. Then, the girl completely lost control, screaming about how much she hated her sister. George told her not to get so worked up, saying Rihanna was just crying nonsense. Elizabeth replied that they might have to speed up their plans. Soon, another celebration was held at the mansion, with guests dancing and having a wonderful time. George and his wife arrived in the hall dressed in magnificent attire. The man saw Duke MacDonald and immediately rushed over to greet him. He introduced his wife, Rihanna, who also greeted the guest, saying it was wonderful of him to hire George. Duke MacDonald then replied that Count Royd had done an excellent job managing the Norton Hotel, and that good managers make excellent officials. Rihanna just sneered at this. If the Duke weren't a complete idiot, he would know that all the credit belonged to her and her father's help, and that George was just a figurehead. The girl was pulled back to her senses by a woman standing on the balcony. It was Elizabeth, and she was looking meaningfully at the couple, especially at George. The man immediately turned away from his wife, saying he was going to the restroom. Making his way through the crowd, George headed straight for the balcony where his lover was. She had said she would go first and that he should wait a moment, and then follow her. George blushed, looking forward to a wonderful time with the girl. A moment later, he followed. Rihanna watched them closely from downstairs, seeing her husband disappear around the corner. She clenched her fists in anger and turned towards the exit. Once outside, she slammed the door shut and let her emotions erupt. She thought she had already accepted the fact that her husband was cheating, but now, crying over what she had just witnessed, she realized she hadn't. George was climbing the ladder through illicit deals. He was a complete scoundrel, and Rihanna blamed herself for not seeing through him sooner. Her thoughts were interrupted by a stranger offering her a handkerchief. When Rihanna looked up, she saw a young, dark-haired man. He told her she should dry her tears. The girl managed a weak smile and took the handkerchief from the man's hand. She dabbed her eyes with it and thanked the stranger for his kindness. Suddenly, she noticed letters embroidered on the handkerchief, spelling out Alexander Estraz. Rihanna immediately curtsied and greeted the distinguished guest, because standing before her was none other than the son of Estraz, His Imperial Highness. The man recognized the girl as Countess Royd and asked why she was crying on such a fine day. But Rihanna said it was just some dust in her eye. Then His Highness said that the Countess was apparently daring to lie in front of her ruler. But the girl apologized and replied that it was a private matter. She apologized for disturbing the great prince of the empire on his walk and said she would be heading back. Rihanna immediately turned and walked back inside, leaving the man alone. Just then, a red-haired man approached the prince. He wondered why Lady Royd was crying, and if it was tears of joy because her husband had become an official. But Alexander wasn't so sure about that, and added that they were destined to meet again when he could get his handkerchief back. When Rihanna returned to her room, she and her maid discussed everything. Margaret couldn't believe her master had accepted a bribe. The mistress understood that her husband had gotten the funds from somewhere. He had either used the Royd family's private assets or embezzled assets from the Norton Hotel. She added that because of this affair, she and her father could be dragged into this whole mess, so they needed to be careful. Rihanna told Margaret to let her know if she found anything strange in George's room while cleaning, and that she herself would carefully check the family hotel's financial records. She also asked the maid if everything they had discussed was ready. Margaret confirmed and added that there was only a week left until the master started his new job, but she had to stop as another maid entered the room. She handed the Countess a drink to relieve fatigue, saying she should drink it before bed. After taking a sip, Rihanna commented that it was a bit bitter, and the maid noted that she must have put in too much cabbage. However, before the mistress could reply, the cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The girl was losing consciousness, and the maids immediately rushed to her side. They tried to get the mistress to come to her senses, but Rihanna replied that she was fine, just a sudden headache. Margaret, worried that her severe migraines were acting up again, offered to call the family doctor, but the girl replied that she was fine, as the family doctor had said she just needed more rest. But before she could finish, a thought flashed through her mind. Rihanna sneered and said it was just a migraine. She said she had already had a full checkup with the family doctor, but everything was fine, so she would get better soon. The maid who had brought her the herbal tea told her to let her know if the pain didn't go away soon. She left the room, leaving Rihanna and Margaret alone. Then, the girl asked her maid to find a doctor for her, but to do it secretly, without anyone else from the Royd household knowing. Once everything was arranged, the girl went to see the doctor, accompanied by her maid, and introduced herself as Margaret Sand. She said she suffered from severe migraines and hadn't had her period for 2 months. The man then asked if the girl was married, but she replied that she wasn't pregnant as she hadn't been intimate with anyone for some time. Rihanna said money was no object, so she asked the doctor to run all possible tests and give her a full physical examination. Shortly after the girls left the clinic, Margaret wondered if her mistress thought their family doctor had falsified all the test results. Rihanna countered that he was a Royd family man, and after her husband's betrayal, she couldn't trust anyone from their house. Margaret had no words for this and just held her mistress's hand, trying to let her know she would support her. After a while, the mistress's carriage finally returned to the mansion. After stepping out, the girl was stunned by the sight before her. In the courtyard stood a young man in a black suit, and Margaret recognized him as Lord Nivet. She was also surprised, not understanding why he would be at the hotel. Rihanna guessed he was there to find a new love. After all, it had been 4 years since the Lord and her sister Elizabeth broke up, which was enough time for him to start a new life. Margaret was completely clueless, but Rihanna just told her to hurry inside. Suddenly, the lady noticed the coachman who had driven them back to the hotel. The maid asked if the lady was all right, but the girl said she was fine and then went inside. Later, while Rihanna and Elizabeth were having tea, the younger sister asked the older one if she was sick. Rihanna was very surprised by this question. Elizabeth had heard that she had gone to see a doctor in town that day and wanted to know if her sister was unwell, adding that she should have just consulted the family doctor directly. Rihanna, unsure how to respond, asked Liz how she knew she had gone to town. The girl replied that Margaret had told her everything since they went together. Then Rihanna thought that the maid couldn't possibly have told her anything, and then she remembered the coachman, feeling she had seen him before. Elizabeth asked her sister why she hadn't told her anything and if something serious had happened. But Rihanna simply replied that she wasn't sick and that it was Margaret who needed to see a doctor. She just didn't feel comfortable letting her go alone in her condition. She added with a smile that she wouldn't dare trouble the family doctor for a mere maid. Elizabeth gave a false smile, understanding that everything was fine. As the tea session ended, she hugged her sister, saying she had been truly worried about her. Rihanna returned to her room and told Margaret that the coachman was secretly reporting everything to Liz. She asked the maid to find a new carriage with a reliable coachman, but to do so discreetly. Rihanna also told Margaret to make sure the doctor they saw wouldn't talk, and to let him know that if someone offered him money, they could offer more. It was then that the girl realized in horror that what she had always feared was truly happening. Her sister was spying on her. Meanwhile, it was an important day for George, his first day at work. Rihanna helped him get ready, feigning genuine happiness for her husband. The man said he had always dreamed of being a government official, just like his father and grandfather. While she was helping him with his tie, she clearly tightened it too much, to the point where George struggled to breathe. Rihanna then apologized, saying she was just too nervous, but then wished her husband a wonderful day. Soon, the man arrived at his workplace, where he was immediately introduced to the other members of the team. But before he could even greet them, a colleague pointed to something beside him. It was a basket of fresh flowers, which the colleague's guest was sent by Mrs. Royd to congratulate her husband. George picked up the flowers, but said his wife was making a big deal out of it. There was also a note inside the bouquet, and as he read it, his face contorted with fear. But noticing his colleague's concern, he simply said it was a touching note from his wife. The colleagues just smiled and quickly left George alone with the letter, which contained only a brief sentence: "I know what you did." As soon as George returned home, he immediately showed the note to Elizabeth, but she was equally baffled, having no idea who could be behind it. The man was terrified, explaining that the letter had been delivered with the flowers. He grabbed her, stammering and whining that it was as if he were being haunted by a ghost. But Liz just gripped his wrist tightly, telling him to calm down. But Royd wouldn't stop, terrified that someone else knew about his affair, or that someone would find out he had bribed Duke MacDonald to get the job of Minister of Finance. Before he could finish his sentence, Elizabeth slapped him, telling him to shut up at once. She glared at him, ordering him to get a grip. Then George reached for his sweetheart, his eyes filling with tears as he began to sob. He looked at her, unable to understand who was behind all of this. Liz sat down beside him, trying to remain calm, and said it was just a minor threat. Besides, those people couldn't do anything without solid proof. She moved closer to him, assuring him that no one could hurt them. At that moment, Rihanna was resting in her room, and Margaret asked her when they should send the next package. The lady said that sending threats too often wasn't wise. She wanted to torment those wretched people bit by bit, giving them some time to sweat it out. Rihanna declared that, starting today, she would slowly drive them into the abyss of despair. Margaret also mentioned that her mistress had received a letter from the royal family at the Central Imperial Palace. The contents of the letter took Rihanna by surprise. In it, the emperor requested her presence at the Central Imperial Palace to return a handkerchief. At the appointed time, the girl arrived at the palace, and Alexander was already waiting for her. He asked if she knew why he had summoned her there. Rihanna was certain that it was not just about the man wanting his handkerchief back. The emperor then smiled smugly, saying he actually just wanted to have lunch and a chat with the duchess. The girl replied coldly that if this was about the tax officer, she had paid all her dues to the state treasury every year. Just then, Alexander asked with a hint of mockery whether the Norton financial reports were all above board. The question made Rihanna nervous, as she had no idea what George might have screwed up. She swore to the heavens that she had never done anything underhanded. Alexander pointed out that not everything in the world was under her supervision. Rihanna realized that, just as she suspected, George was using the hotel's money for his transactions, and the Emperor knew he had spent the Norton family's money on bribery. So the Emperor had summoned her today to ascertain whether she was involved. She then declared that if any impropriety had occurred beyond her sight, be it by family or others, she would find the culprits and make them pay the price. After all, nothing was more important to her than the Norton Hotel. She also apologized for not returning his handkerchief personally, saying it was impolite of her to cause him so much trouble over such a trivial matter. Alexander simply smiled, saying the situation allowed them to meet for lunch and that he just wanted to talk with the lady. After Rihanna left the palace, an advisor approached the Emperor and asked if such a meeting was too risky, because if Miss Royd were involved in the Earl's affairs, she would destroy all the evidence the moment she returned home. But Alexander, recalling her words, expressed his doubts. Judging by Rihanna's demeanor, her husband was embroiled in more than just some suspicious financial issues. If he were in Miss Royd's shoes, he would have reported George without a second thought. But if she didn't do it herself, the Emperor would show no mercy to the Norton Hotel. Soon, Rihanna and Margaret were back at the hotel. In the hall, George and Elizabeth were sitting at a table. The girl was surprised that her sister had returned so quickly, and Rihanna asked what the two of them were doing there together. Liz then said that George simply wanted to ask for some advice about something. The man confirmed the girl's words, saying he wanted her opinion on how a certain dress would look on Rihanna. He then opened a gift box and pulled out a long, gray dress decorated with ruffles and gems. Elizabeth commented that the dress would be perfect for her sister. Rihanna smiled and thanked her husband for the gift. But as soon as she was alone, she took a pair of scissors, cut the dress into pieces, and then threw all the scraps into the bin. Margaret didn't understand why her mistress was destroying such a beautiful dress, but Rihanna just ordered her to burn everything that was left of it at once. Standing in front of the fireplace and watching the pieces of fabric burn, the girl said that His Majesty knew about George's schemes, and that's why he had called her in today to ask if she was involved. Margaret was confused as to why His Majesty would ask her directly, given the high probability that she would tell her husband everything. But Rihanna declared that if she wanted to protect the Norton Hotel, she had to tell the Emperor everything to prove that George and Duke MacDonald were collaborating. The maid was stunned. Was her mistress really asking her to betray her master? Rihanna replied that if Margaret chose George over the hotel, then the hotel would be doomed. So they needed to find all the evidence they could. They would need to search George's room thoroughly, and in the meantime, she would keep a close watch on the hotel. The following day, the hotel held a tea party, inviting several ladies from high society. One of the guests announced that her daughter would be getting married soon. The wedding was in a month, and she had come to invite Mrs. Royd to the celebration. The groom was the son of the Knivet family. The bride's mother said she would be very happy to see Rihanna at the wedding, but she hoped Elizabeth would not attend, mentioning that she had nothing against her, but many men, are quite taken with her, and she would be too much of a distraction. But Rihanna simply smiled at Mrs. Showbolt and told her not to worry. As Margaret and her mistress were sitting in the carriage, the maid asked if the Showbolt family's daughter was truly marrying the son of the Knivet family. Rihanna told her not to try to read her mind. She said it was just a wedding, and that was all. Margaret agreed, saying that whatever happened in the past was now over. Rihanna figured her test results should be available by now, so they should head to the clinic after lunch to avoid the crowds. Before long, the girls reached their destination. Rihanna opened the door and bumped right into a man in the doorway. The man apologized, but then he saw Rihanna standing there and appeared completely shocked. She wondered why, of all times, she had to run into him now after so long. But she remained composed and congratulated him on his engagement. She tried to move past him, but the man caught her by the hand. He said he needed to talk with Rihanna. Once inside and seated at a table, she asked Earl Knivet what he wanted to discuss. He said that they knew each other, so she could relax and be herself. But Rihanna replied that she saw no reason to act so informally with a man who was soon to be married. Knivet chuckled, saying she hadn't changed a bit, but he wanted to get a few things off his chest before his wedding and also see how she had been since that day, after which he had never truly opened up to her again. Rihanna wondered if it looked strange for the two representatives of families with a broken engagement to be seen together. The man then told her the real reason for his breakup with her sister, Elizabeth, which was not what she had thought. Rihanna was utterly confused, so Nivet explained everything to her in detail. He said he was told their engagement was canceled, and then suddenly, Rihanna's marriage was announced. Elizabeth went completely mad upon hearing of her sister's wedding. She begged him to call off their engagement, and when he refused, she began to threaten and harass him relentlessly. Nivet said she even sent him a note written in her own blood, which compelled him to tear up the marriage contract. Liz had constantly threatened to make his life a living hell if they married. Rihanna couldn't believe Elizabeth was capable of such a thing, but the man said she had no idea just how bad it had been. He then asked her if she had noticed anything wrong with Liz and George living with her. Before she could answer, he stated flatly that Elizabeth was copying her. Liz was not right from the start. He and Rihanna had feelings for each other, but her sister's ridiculous obsession got in their way before they even knew what was happening. Nivet claimed that Rihanna had let her sister steal him away. Rihanna blushed, saying that nothing had happened at the time. They weren't even dating, despite being close. The man said that it was Elizabeth who had asked his family for the engagement, even though they had never even spoken to each other before. Only then did the girl realize she had never truly considered it. Her sister had told her she'd fallen for Lord Nivet at first sight during a ball. She had said it was no big deal, as Rihanna wasn't interested in him anyway. The man then went on to say that Liz had dumped him the moment she found out about Rihanna's marriage. She had lost all interest in him because, at that point, it was impossible for anything to happen between him and her sister. Just as Nivet and Rihanna's relationship was starting to become more than a friendship, Elizabeth demanded marriage. But as soon as the girl married someone else, she immediately dumped him. Nivet told the girl to be wary of her sister because she was not right in the head and would one day stab her in the back. Even after returning to her residence, Rihanna couldn't stop thinking about the matter. But Elizabeth interrupted her thoughts, wondering what was bothering her twin sister so much. The girl then replied that something interesting had happened the day before. She said she had received an invitation to the wedding of Lord Nivet and Miss Showbolt. Liz just scoffed and went on with her meal. Rihanna then asked if her sister was all right, to which she replied, "That's all in the past, Rihanna." Rihanna decided to ask Liz why she had broken up with the man who gave her the necklace. Elizabeth simply said they were not a good match, that she had been madly in love with him and had even sworn to get engaged, but she wasn't truly ready for marriage and felt that such a choice required great caution. Rihanna chuckled in agreement with her sister, but she still knew that Liz would have to settle down someday. The girl assured her that she understood this as well. She then moved her chair closer to her sister and said she truly loved living with her. Elizabeth said she didn't want to be apart from her, which was why she was in no rush to marry. Putting on an innocent act, she asked if Rihanna was trying to marry her off because she was tired of having her around. But the girl simply reassured her sister that it wasn't like that. Liz then remembered how Rihanna had taken her in during her own honeymoon when she and Lord Nivet broke up. That was when she realized how much her sister loved her. Rihanna said they were not just sisters but like twins, so her love for her went beyond mere kinship. Liz hugged her sister, saying she loved her too, but the crazed look in her eyes told a different story. Just then, Rihanna reached for Elizabeth's neck, about to remove the necklace from her. However, a maid entering the hall interrupted her, announcing the master's return. George stood behind her, and Liz was about to rush over to him when she suddenly noticed his condition. The man was completely drunk, grinning like an idiot and waving at the women. He said he had a few drinks with his pals from the Ministry of Finance. Elizabeth took George's arm, planning to help him to the bedroom, but before she could finish speaking, he shrugged her off, stumbled forward, and threw his arms around Rihanna, saying how happy he was to see his lovely wife. Liz watched the couple jealously, clearly unhappy that her lover was suddenly noticing his wife. Rihanna forced a smile, saying she would try harder to make George this happy more often. Soon, the man was settled into bed, and when he woke up, Elizabeth was standing there. George was instantly terrified, as she shouldn't have been there. But then Liz said her sister had asked her to wake him and bring him to the hall, where she was preparing onion soup for his hangover. She complained that he needed to hurry up, otherwise Rihanna might become suspicious. The man reached for his girl, held her tight, and asked how much longer they had to live this way. The girl smiled and said it wouldn't be for much longer. She said she was already on the final sprint. While everyone was at the table, Rihanna announced her intention to invite George's colleagues home for dinner. She felt that she had been severely neglecting her wifely duties recently. Rihanna said said it would also be an opportunity for George to show off to his colleagues and boost his self-esteem. The man proudly proclaimed it was an excellent idea, and since Rihanna had been doing a terrible job as a wife, it was good that she was finally noticing. Because even without him saying so, Rihanna should have known these things and handled them to perfection. The woman smiled slyly, saying she would be sure to handle everything perfectly and that she was looking forward to what was to come in a few weeks. Just then, something dripped onto the tablecloth, and Rihanna's nose began to bleed. George asked if she was all right, but she said she was just tired. Elizabeth helped wipe the blood away, telling her she needed to get more rest. Not long after, Rihanna went back to the doctor, and she was completely stunned by what he told her. The doctor said that if her condition continued as it was, she wouldn't survive for more than a year. He explained that she had been consuming small doses of a harmful substance for a long time. All her symptoms pointed to the early stages of poisoning. Her condition would deteriorate, leading to paralysis, and then that would be the end. Margaret was so shocked she broke down in tears, asking if there was any way to cure her mistress. The doctor said they first needed to eliminate the source of the poison and asked if she knew of anyone around her who could be administering it. Rihanna knew that something like this would be impossible without the servants' involvement. It wasn't difficult to guess that they were aware of the secret affair, but she couldn't imagine Elizabeth wanting her dead just to inherit the family estate. She didn't even realize when it all began. For the whole 4 years of her marriage, had these people truly wished for her death? This was it. She couldn't bear it any longer. As she tried to get up, everything went dark and she passed out. They carried Rihanna to a bed where Margaret watched over her. After a while, she awoke, and the maid immediately told her that the doctor was developing an antidote to cure her. Then Rihanna said they had to change their plans, because simply marrying Elizabeth off to some other man was too boring. Now, she couldn't believe she had ever even considered letting her live. Now Rihanna wanted to keep her by her side, to make her watch as her dear little sister lost everything and became miserable, and then she would send her off in the most painful way imaginable. She also told Margaret that if she was too afraid to go on, she could back out. But the maid simply knelt before her mistress, saying it was an honor to serve someone as remarkable as her, and that she would stay until the very end. Rihanna was deeply moved, and with tears in her eyes, she hugged the girl tightly, thanking her for her unwavering support. Margaret told her not to cry, that she needed to be strong, and she promised that all those who deserved it would get there, just deserts. Then Rihanna said they must act normally, as if they knew nothing. When the three of them were at the table together again, Rihanna told her sister she shouldn't be in a hurry to get married, much to her surprise. She said she had been pushing Liz too hard recently, especially since she had just gotten out of a relationship. George agreed, saying there was no reason to rush. Elizabeth was also pleased, saying she was truly relieved that the pressure was finally off. What's more, she said she couldn't wait to see Rihanna and George's baby. Rihanna could hardly believe it. Was she really planning to kill both her and the baby? But she replied that she was looking forward to meeting him too. All the while, the girl was thinking about how she truly wanted to see her sister come to a tragic and horrifying end. After breakfast, Rihanna went outside to see her husband off to work. She told him he looked wonderful and wished him a great day. The moment George was gone, Rihanna called for Margaret. She slipped her husband's Ministry of Finance badge, which she had hidden up her sleeve, into the maid's hand. Margaret was confused, not understanding why her mistress would need something so important to the master. Rihanna then told the girl to take the badge to the office. Soon, Margaret encountered George, who told her to let his wife know he would be home late. The maid then asked what the master had planned, but the man said he didn't have to explain himself to her and told her to just say he had a meeting. The moment George was out of sight, Margaret made a beeline for the ladies' washroom. Rihanna had asked her to find out about her husband's life at the Ministry of Finance and why he always returned home late and drunk. Margaret knew there was no better place for snooping than the maid's washroom. The girl overheard that Marquis Pecans had been very irritable recently. The maids were saying that he seemed to be thoroughly annoyed by the Earl of Norton, a man he couldn't stand. Soon, Margaret reported everything she had overheard to her mistress. Marquis Allegory Pecans came from a family renowned since ancient times for its intellect in the hard sciences. She then had Margaret procure something for her, an invitation to an upcoming banquet. Rihanna smiled, as things were becoming more and more interesting. Meanwhile, George was drunk again, staggering down the street, bottle in hand, propping himself up against a wall. Suddenly, a stack of documents performance was thrown at him as someone yelled that it was complete trash, not proper work. Marquis Pecans was furious, saying the man couldn't even manage the simplest of tasks. He couldn't believe he had been hired on a recommendation. He noted that everyone who got a job through a recommendation from Duke MacDonald was just like George. That evening, the man returned home, unable to walk by himself, and had to be supported by the servants. Rihanna asked what had happened, but George replied that women wouldn't understand men's problems. After her husband calmed down, the girl mentioned that she had discovered a very good book that day, which turned out to be written by one of Pecan's ancestors. Upon hearing this, George immediately leaped from his seat. Rihanna remarked that her husband was fortunate to have a boss from such a noble family. She left the book on the table, suggesting George should read it in his free time, after which he would have more respect for the Marquis. When a man was alone, he furiously hurled the book at the wall. Meanwhile, Rihanna went down to the garden, where Elizabeth was waiting. She told her sister that George was already asleep after a difficult day at work. Liz said that her brother-in-law's boss was giving him a hard time at work, and that Rihanna didn't seem concerned enough. She then asked if the Marquis was truly making things difficult for her husband. But Elizabeth said it was just a gut feeling, yet she still asked her sister to investigate a bit. Rihanna simply thanked her for the advice and mentioned that she was, in fact, planning something for the next day. Meanwhile, a new day dawned, and George went to work with a splitting headache, counting down the minutes to lunch. Suddenly, there was a knock on his office door. It was Rihanna. She had brought a few maids with her, and the man couldn't understand what she was doing there at this time. She then announced she was there to thank the officials who worked day and night for the emperor and the nation. The maids brought out several boxes of cookies, and the lady invited everyone to help themselves. George couldn't understand what this was all about. Rihanna said her husband had been under a lot of work stress recently, so she just wanted to make sure he was being looked after. The man was flustered, not knowing what to say. She then wished him a good rest of the day and turned to leave. In the hallway, she ran into a man and told him she had been worried she would leave without getting to see him. After speaking with the stranger, she stepped outside, thinking that all the preparations were now complete and all she had to do was wait. Suddenly, the emperor approached from behind her, asking what brought the Countess of Norden here. She replied that she was there to inspect the Ministry of Finance, but he added that she likely also wanted to pay her respects to her husband's team. Rihanna guessed someone was spying on her, most likely the emperor's advisor. Alexander remarked that she seemed to truly love her husband. Rihanna answered coolly that she was his wife, so she was simply doing her best. The emperor asked if the man she loved with all her heart had ever betrayed her. He explained his curiosity, saying he was wondering how she would react in that kind of situation. The girl then replied that she would pay him back in kind, making the man feel the same pain she did, or even twice as much. The emperor responded that he hoped she would keep that train of thought. He said he was very fond of that notion. Rihanna then decided to ask the man the same question, and Alexander replied that he had been betrayed many times. The girl asked what he had done to them, but he couldn't tell her of any epic revenge, as the person was no longer among the living. Rihanna hesitated and wished that he would never have to experience such a thing again, a sentiment the emperor returned. And so, they parted ways. The man went into the building, leaving Rihanna by herself. That night, as planned, the guests arrived at the hotel. George welcomed them, thanking them for coming. The guests showered compliments on the manor's interior, and the man said it was all his wife's doing. Suddenly, a female guest noticed her dish was different from the others. George immediately flew into a rage at Rihanna, accusing her of being clueless. But she calmly replied that she had served that particular dish because she knew the Countess was a vegetarian. The girl admired Mrs. Royden's insight, but she said it was nothing special. George immediately shut his mouth, realizing he had yelled at his wife for no reason. Meanwhile, the guests commented that the Earl should cherish such a considerate wife, who could manage both the hotel and the household. George felt confused because he was the master of the manor and the star of the day, but Rihanna was stealing the show. Just then, a servant informed him that another guest had arrived. The Earl was surprised, as he hadn't invited anyone else. When he turned to see who had arrived, he was even more shocked. It was Marquis Pecans. He apologized for his tardiness and then walked in. Rihanna quickly reassured him that it was fine, as she arranged for the Marquis to be seated, inviting him to join them for the meal. George immediately jumped up from his seat and was about to speak to his wife, but at that moment, he met Pekins's gaze. He awkwardly greeted the Marquis, saying he hadn't expected to see him today. Pekins then asked if he was displeased by his arrival, and George quickly assured him that he didn't mean that at all, saying he just hadn't thought someone as busy as the Marquis would have time for such an event. The Marquis asked if that was why he hadn't been invited, because if he hadn't run into Mrs. Royden, he wouldn't have even known about the party. George was surprised. When did Rihanna have time to go to the Ministry of Finance? Then he remembered her bringing him cookies a few days ago. He grew angry, thinking she should have left after dropping off the items instead of inviting his superior to the party. Then Pekins asked, "Why the long face, son? Is it because you intentionally didn't invite me, rather than it being an accidental oversight?" George lowered his head, saying he wouldn't dare be so rude. Pekins chuckled, saying that despite all his foolishness, he still had some manners. George said nothing, just thinking to himself that he was done for. As the guests tasted the food, they said Rihanna's desserts were truly wonderful. George was about to breathe a sigh of relief, thinking everyone would leave soon, but then Rihanna suggested giving the guests a tour of the mansion. She said it would be nice to show them the collection in the drawing room. The guests were confused, not knowing what collection she was referring to. Then, the girl led them to a room that looked more like a library. She said she collected rare ancient documents and would give each guest a book they would greatly enjoy. The guests were overwhelmed by the hotel's stunning decor and the Countess's elegant hobby. Soon, the guests dispersed to look through the books, and just then, Earl Pekins noticed a binding he recognized. He picked up the book and realized it was the very work his father had written as a scholar, and he never thought he'd see it here. But when he opened the book, he suddenly began to tremble, his face contorted with rage. The book was filled with Mr. Royden's notes. Before the young man could say a word, Pekins threw the book at him. George opened the book and saw the pages were filled with vicious comments about the author and the work itself. He then remembered writing them one day when he came home dead drunk and had completely forgotten about it afterward. He tried to explain, but Pekins wouldn't listen. It was clearly his handwriting. The Marquis knew George didn't respect him as a superior, but he never thought he would be so bold as to insult his family like this. This was almost equivalent to declaring war on the Pekins family. For George to dare disrespect his father, the Chancellor, it seemed his future days at the Ministry of Finance would become very interesting. Just then, the Earl fell to his knees, grabbing his superior's trousers and begging for forgiveness. But Pekins just slapped his hands away, saying he didn't want to stay a second longer. After the Marquis left, all the other guests followed him out of the room, telling the Countess not to see them out. Rihanna bid everyone farewell. Watching the guests leave their home, she turned to her husband after everyone was gone and asked if he was all right. The guy yelled at her, saying she was asking such a stupid question because his career was basically over. He blamed everything on his wife and the damned book she had brought home. As George collapsed to the floor, Rihanna couldn't help but smile, knowing this was far from over and things couldn't possibly end over something so small. She turned to her husband and begged him to calm down. The girl said it wasn't over yet because she would always support him. Then George reached out and hugged his wife, apologizing for yelling at her. Rihanna just told him she would do anything for her husband. The next day, the girl decided to take a rose petal bath. Margaret congratulated her, saying it was the first time she had seen the mistress smile, and it warmed her heart. But Rihanna knew this was just the beginning of her plan. Meanwhile, George headed to the Ministry of Finance. Standing at the entrance, he remembered his wife's words. She had told him that admitting one's mistakes and asking for forgiveness is what a real man does. George thought to himself that Rihanna was right. People would surely understand him. He was still young and had just made a mistake. As he walked toward his boss's office, his colleagues gave him skeptical looks. He picked up the documents on his desk and with a determined expression, walked straight to Pekins's office. Meanwhile, Rihanna had obtained documents proving her husband's shady dealings. It turned out he had been hiding the hotel's profits. She was furious, thinking how dare he do such a thing, the nerve of him. So she ordered her subordinate to hide all the records and keep the matter a secret. Rihanna told her employee that she didn't intend to cover up for her husband's mistakes, but to truly bring him down, she needed to wait for the perfect opportunity. The tax audit was coming soon, and those documents must not fall into the wrong hands. The maid pointed out that they couldn't hide the documents forever, but Rihanna quickly reassured her, saying she already had a plan and the others just needed to follow her orders. Meanwhile, George entered Pekins's office, saying he had finished his report and wanted to talk to his superior. But the Marquis just swept all the documents onto the floor, saying it was trash, not a report. George stared at his feet in disbelief, then bent down to pick up the papers. He asked his superior to point out what was wrong with his report. Then Pecan stood up and placed his shoe directly on the documents. He looked at the young man with an expression of pure contempt and asked if he now understood what was wrong with the report. Just then, George shouted that this was too much, that a superior should point out an employee's mistakes and tell them how to fix them. Hearing the talk about superiors, Pecans just sneered. He grabbed the young man by the collar and asked if he had ever once considered him his superior. George said there had been a misunderstanding, but this only made Pecans angrier, bringing up the insulting comments in the book again. The young man desperately pleaded for his superior to calm down, but he just kept yelling. Pecan said if he made one more excuse, he should get out of the Ministry of Finance immediately. But George stood his ground, not moving an inch. The Marquis roared that he wouldn't say it a second time. The Earl decided to remain silent, turned, and walked out of the office, leaving under the watchful eyes of his colleagues. In the evening, Elizabeth was taking a carefree stroll through the palace. She found George in the dining room, sitting alone in dead silence, unwilling to say what had happened. So the girl stepped on his foot with her high heel and, in a ruder tone this time, asked what he was doing here. George replied that his boss had gone crazy, so he wouldn't be working at the Ministry of Finance anymore. He said he would submit his resignation, as he had enough money to live comfortably for a long time. Then he asked Liz where she had been so early. Just then, Rihanna entered the dining room and overheard their conversation. She asked why he was talking about resigning. The guy angrily slammed his fist on the table, saying Pecans had ruined the report he had worked so hard on for 4 whole days and then chewed him out, so he was done for good. He sighed, saying now he could finally get to work on running the hotel. Rihanna gave a nervous laugh, thinking her husband was crazy to be dreaming of running the hotel. She said high society would soon be buzzing with talk of how George had annoyed his superior and then thrown a tantrum at him. Then she took his hand, saying it didn't matter who was right or wrong. What mattered was that he could no longer work at the place he had always wanted to. George knew that, but he had already messed things up and now didn't know how to fix it. Then Rihanna said he should go to the Marquis and beg for forgiveness, even getting on his knees if necessary. Hearing this, George yelled because he was a nobleman, the head of the Royden family, and he couldn't do something like that. Then Rihanna reminded him that he had already knelt in front of everyone yesterday. The guy just waved it off dismissively, saying that was completely different. He had no choice then. He yelled that he couldn't do it with a clear conscience. Then he stormed out of the room. Liz called after him, but he didn't even pay attention. Just then, the girl turned to her sister with a sly smile on her face. She asked her how she had been feeling lately. Rihanna clenched her fists in anger and snapped, "Why the sudden concern for my physical condition?" Liz replied that her sister always looked tired, as if something was bothering her. Rihanna just said she was just tired from taking care of the guests, and that was all. Then Elizabeth said she was also worried about her brother-in-law, because deep down, he was a sensitive person and he shouldn't have to demean himself like that for a superior. The girl grabbed her sister's shoulder and said that humiliation is temporary, but a position is for life. If you think about it from the perspective of George's wife, who will spend her life with him, it's obvious which choice is better. Then Rihanna left the room, leaving her sister alone with her thoughts. That night, as Liz and George were in bed, she told them Rihanna's advice wasn't so bad. George was startled, not understanding why his beloved wanted him to submit as well. Then Elizabeth said it would be hard for him to find a new job, and she wanted to be the wife of a man who made her proud, not ashamed. She kissed the young man, asking him not to make her have to defend him all the time. The girl gently caressed George's cheek, saying she believed in him. The next day, as Rihanna was calmly drinking her tea, Margaret knocked on her door. She reported that the master had already left for work. Meanwhile, George decided to take the advice and knelt before Pecans, drawing surprised looks from his colleagues. He said he had made a huge mistake and begged his superior to forgive him. But Pecans just told him to get up off the floor, saying it wouldn't do him any good. But George remained on his knees, apologizing for the incident at the mansion over the weekend and for yesterday's report. Then Pecans roared for him to get up at once, as no one wanted to see him grovel like that. He said the problem wasn't just the argument with him, but that George's skills were so poor he was a disgrace to the entire Ministry of Finance, only hired because of his connections. Meanwhile, Rihanna and Margaret were sitting at a chessboard, and the girl wondered if Marquis Pecans would really go easy on him. Then Rihanna said they needed to make George keep apologizing until his superior forgave him, no matter how much time and effort it took. He should do everything he can to keep his job, because imagine the despair when he finally loses it anyway. Overwhelmed with emotion, the girl pushed a chess piece so hard that it flew off the table and shattered on the floor. Then Rihanna stood up from the table, saying they needed to make a trip to the hospital today. There was something she needed to confirm. Soon, the girls arrived at the doctor's office. The doctor said the patient's condition had improved, and according to her, the headaches were subsiding, so the doctor told her to continue with the same medication. Then Rihanna asked him if anyone had come to inquire about her health. The doctor replied that Margaret's sister had come by yesterday. Rihanna thought to herself, wait, isn't my maiden only child? The doctor added that the girl said her sister was unwell, but didn't want to talk to her family about it. Then Rihanna asked what the doctor had told her. The doctor quickly assured her that any patient's information was confidential and he wouldn't disclose it, not even to family. So, he told a white lie, saying the girl was just a little overworked. Rihanna thanked him and asked him to keep her condition a secret from everyone. In the evening, George came to the dining room to eat with everyone. He said he had done everything Rihanna asked. The guy slammed his fist on the table, saying he had knelt and begged for forgiveness in his right mind. He claimed that, according to him, the entire Ministry of Finance was there, but the Marquis just wouldn't forgive him. He was a cold and heartless guy, so George was determined to get revenge. Then Rihanna said that a gentleman's revenge can wait 10 years, and she would be happy to see it happen. But deep down, she was formulating her own plan for revenge. George puffed out his chest and said he would definitely let her see that day. It would just take a little time. He took his wife's hand, which greatly annoyed Elizabeth, who was at the same table. Soon, it was the day of Miss Showbolt's wedding, and Rihanna and George arrived at the church for the ceremony. The butler greeted them and asked the lady for her invitation, but for some reason, she couldn't find it in her handbag. Just then, the young man said he would go check the guest list himself. Rihanna frowned. She was sure she had taken the invitation when she left the house. George was displeased. He couldn't believe his wife would forget something so important. The girl told him to calm down and not make a big deal out of it, especially after the incident at the Ministry of Finance. Soon, the butler returned to the couple and said their names were on the list, so they could go in. The bride was already inside, and she greeted Countess Royden. Rihanna congratulated the girl on her wedding and wished her all the best. But then, someone called her from behind. When Rihanna turned around, she saw Elizabeth in a gorgeous red dress. The bride's mood instantly soured upon seeing the very girl who had broken off her engagement with her fiancé 4 years ago. Rihanna immediately rushed to her sister's side and asked what she was doing here. Liz replied in an innocent tone that she had come to congratulate Miss Showbolt on her wedding. Rihanna grabbed her arm and dragged her towards the exit. Once outside, Liz said, "What's wrong with you? Why are you making such a scene?" Rihanna demanded, "How on earth did you get in? You weren't invited." Then Elizabeth produced an envelope. "Sister, you left your invitation at home." At that moment, Rihanna realized who was behind the disappearing act. Suddenly, George rushed up to them, interrupting her thoughts. He turned to Rihanna. "All right, explain yourself. What is all this about?" Then Elizabeth chimed in. "This whole thing is so hurtful, you know? I just came to bring her the invitation," she said, "and she dragged me out as soon as I came in." George put his arm around the girl's shoulder and said, "Rihanna, you're being too harsh on your sister." The girl didn't answer, just walked past them, asking her husband to take Liz home while she went to apologize to the bride. The moment Rihanna disappeared around the corner, the innocent expression on Elizabeth's face vanished. George asked her why she had come without an invitation. Then Liz said she did it on purpose because she wanted to see her sister get upset. George noted that the girl clearly disliked her twin sister very much. Then the girl said she had hated her for so long that she wanted to kill her. Liz didn't like being born a twin, and the younger one at that. Just because she was born 5 minutes later, she had to live in Rihanna's shadow. Only Rihanna got to monopolize their mother's love. She got the right to manage their father's hotel, and she got love and a chance at life. And Liz wanted to take back everything Rihanna had taken from her, no matter the cost. She was prepared to stab her in the back if necessary. Meanwhile, the wedding ceremony began. The priest read the vows, and the newlyweds promised each other love and fidelity. Then they were pronounced husband and wife, and the guests were asked to bless the couple's future. Rihanna remembered how happy she had been at her own wedding. All she had ever wanted was an ordinary, happy life, and now the desire was gone, leaving only a feeling of devastation. But she wasn't going to give up. She would show them all who would have a last laugh. After the ceremony, everyone returned to their seats. George asked his wife if everything was ready for the upcoming audit. Rihanna said yes. She noticed the guy looked genuinely scared, so she asked if they had a reason to be worried, but George just said this audit would be particularly strict. Rihanna knew this was true. It was the first time the IRS had collected so many documents. She had made sure no information was leaked, but she didn't know how long they could hold out. Then the girl asked Margaret to deliver something to His Majesty. Soon, Rihanna arrived at the palace for an audience with the Emperor. They greeted each other respectfully, and the Emperor asked her to be seated. Alexander thanked her for accepting his invitation. After sitting down at the table, Rihanna noticed that all the dishes were cold. The Emperor then said it had been a while and asked how she had been. Rihanna replied that it was tax audit season, so she had been extremely busy. This way, the Emperor wouldn't have to worry about any unexpected surprises. Rihanna added that her love for the Norton Hotel was so deep that not even a mountain of gold could sway her. Such a thing might happen once in 10,000 years, but it would never happen on her watch. Alexander chuckled, saying it was a rather powerful answer. Then he stood up from behind his desk, walked behind her, and asked where on earth she had hidden the documents. He remembered her saying that if anything went wrong on her watch, she would make the person responsible pay the price. The Emperor then pointed out that, judging by the audit results, it seemed the Countess had changed her mind. After a brief silence, Rihanna replied that nothing had changed. She had requested this meeting today because she had a favor to ask. Alexander was surprised by this answer. So Rihanna said that if the Emperor promised her that the Norton Hotel would not be harmed no matter what happened, she would provide him with everything he needed to handle state affairs, even if it meant sacrificing her husband's reputation or even his life. She thought to herself that His Majesty didn't actually care about the hotel. He wanted to overthrow Duke MacDonald. The Emperor confirmed this, and Rihanna said that if someone wanted to use her husband to take down the Duke, she wouldn't stand his way and would even help him. The offer certainly caught Alexander's attention, but he asked what would happen if she faced criticism for it. Just then, Rihanna said that it was Earl Royden who had betrayed her first. Alexander asked how she planned to get her revenge, because if the Earl fell, his Countess would fall with him. The girl replied that she was planning a divorce. The Emperor commented that it sounded like the betrayal of having the hotel taken from her was a big deal. Then Rihanna said there was another reason. He had been having an affair with another woman, and as she was considering a divorce, another problem arose. The Emperor expressed his sympathy, and she realized it was the first time she had told anyone about this. Unexpectedly, it made her feel much better. The Emperor then promised that the Norton Hotel would not be affected, and if Rihanna was certain she had no part in any shady dealings, he would return the improperly acquired money, even if it came out of his own pocket. Hearing this, the Emperor's advisor covered his face. Rihanna pointed out that the offer was too generous, and she didn't want to be so shameless as to use the ruler's assets. She wanted the culprit to make up for the losses. The stolen funds had to be recovered from the mastermind, no matter what. The Emperor then said that's how it would be. He promised to help her if she needed it, as they were now business partners. Rihanna thought to herself that there was nothing safer than working with the Emperor and thanked him. A short time later, George reported that the tax audit had gone smoothly. He suggested celebrating with champagne, and Rihanna agreed. But Elizabeth suggested holding off on the celebration, as now was a time when they needed to be moderate. Then George remembered it was the anniversary of his father's death. He immediately turned to Rihanna in annoyance, asking if she was preparing for the memorial service, because she had obviously forgotten. George wanted this year's memorial to be better than before, as it was the first one since he took over. Rihanna asked what he meant, but the man said his wife should think about it herself and told her to prepare some drafts and show them to him. The girl was stunned, while George nonchalantly said that just one draft wouldn't pass. Listening to the man scold her sister, Liz smiled smugly. Rihanna said she didn't expect him to be so concerned, since George hadn't even come back to say goodbye when his father died. The man's face twisted in anger. How dare she judge him? He then slammed his fist on the table, saying his father was a bastard who had tormented his mother his whole life, so he didn't deserve his love. After yelling that Rihanna didn't care at all about his mother's suffering, he stormed out. The girls watched him leave in silence. Rihanna sneered. It was ironic that the guy who claimed to understand his mother's pain was behaving exactly like his father. After her husband had calmed down, Rihanna went to his room. She told him that she had cared for his father until his death, and it was just something she had to do without any personal feelings. She had taken care of him when he wouldn't. She hoped he could be grateful for that. George finally thanked his wife, saying it would have looked bad on him if his sick father had been left alone. But despite that, he still couldn't forgive the old man. His mother was too naive. She had given him a legitimate son, and she could have at least fought back against her husband's behavior. Then Rihanna said that George didn't have to forgive his father, because some people in this world just don't deserve forgiveness. The man broke down, thanking his wife for her support. The girl added that he could be in charge of the funeral arrangements. She was planning to do it differently anyway, and she wanted to make it memorable. Then George reached out to hug Rihanna, saying he only trusted her and was glad he married her. He said, "I love you," but she pretended not to hear. A malicious glint flashed in her eyes as she said she was happy to send his father off because he had given her so much. The next morning, Elizabeth was helping George get ready for work, and he was annoyed that his wife was still asleep, acting as if she were the only one in the world who worked. Then Liz pulled him closer and asked what he was complaining about. It was because of this that she could help him get ready. George blushed and stammered that he preferred it this way. Then the lovers kissed and said their goodbyes. After the man left, the maid noticed that he seemed to have forgotten his insignia at home. Elizabeth smiled smugly, feigning surprise. When Rihanna came to the dining room, it was empty, and she asked where her sister was. The maid said the young lady had left very early this morning. Elizabeth herself had already arrived at the Ministry of Finance to return the insignia George had forgotten. The guy didn't expect to see her here at all, but the girl immediately ran to her beloved and hugged him tightly. She took out his insignia, saying she had come to return it to George. The young man thanked Liz, and she asked if he was just going to let her go like that. Then George embraced the girl, holding her tightly and saying there was a nice little spot inside. When the couple got there, George knelt down, held Elizabeth tightly, and kissed her. A while later, the girl returned to the palace, replaying her trip to the Ministry of Finance in her mind with a sly smile on her face. Looking at her sister, she smiled smugly, because the poor thing had no idea what her husband had been up to with her earlier. Then Rihanna said she had made a guest list for the memorial service last night, and wanted her husband to take a look. George was confused, wondering why there were so many people on the list, twice as many as last time. Rihanna said her husband wanted to make the ceremony grand, and she was just following his wishes. The man still agreed to the list, saying the more people, the better. Then Liz asked her sister if she was too tired to entertain so many guests, as she had been looking pale and as if she might get dizzy. Arai smiled and said she would rest after the memorial service. At that moment, both girls thought it would all be over soon, but they each imagined their own ending to this story. When George got to work, someone told him there was a gift waiting for him. It was another bouquet of flowers, and the mere sight of it filled the man with dread. George's colleagues said his wife must be super romantic, always sending such gifts. But when the young man picked up the note from among the flowers, he was terrified because it read, "I know your little secret." George thought to himself, was it exposed during the welcome for the new official, or during that rendezvous in the city center, or perhaps when they met in the empty room at the Ministry of Finance? However, his thoughts were interrupted by the shouts of his colleagues. They announced that the emperor had suddenly arrived at the Ministry of Finance. The next moment, the ruler walked into the building accompanied by his servants, dressed in a white suit. George was a little flustered by this sudden situation and greeted the emperor. Marquis Pecans immediately came out of his office to welcome the ruler and asked why he had come. Alexander said he was there to pay his respects, but it seemed his arrival had caused quite a stir. Pecans quickly assured him that it was their honor to see the emperor. George bowed deeply, saying he would work even harder for the good of the empire. Just then, Alexander caught a glimpse of the letter in the bouquet the man was hiding behind his back. He asked if he was Count Royden, who was hired on recommendation. George answered yes, inwardly pleased that the emperor remembered him. Then Alexander asked if he was enjoying his work at the Ministry of Finance. The young man replied that he had been working very hard. The emperor smiled slyly and said that thanks to such an energetic newcomer, Pecans himself must be feeling more energetic too. But the superior replied that George was quite clumsy, though he was still trying to train him into a good employee. Hearing this, the man's face twisted for a moment, but he decided not to show it. The emperor commented that George had both a peacock and a dove inside him. You might be swept away by the peacock's splendor for a moment and act purely on passion, but you can't be like that forever. A woman like Rihanna was too good for a small fry like him. Nevertheless, the emperor decided not to say more, simply telling Count Royden to become a top-tier professional. George thanked the emperor and swore not to disappoint him. But as soon as Alexander left, the man was back to square one, racking his brain over who had sent the letter. He was still sulking when he got home that evening, and Rihanna asked if something was wrong. George said he was fine, but then asked why there were suddenly so many flowers in the house. Rihanna said she had been browsing the market and bought them on the way back, and that the flowers made the house look very stylish. George didn't show it, but he thought to himself that the bouquet was the same type of flower as these. But his thoughts were interrupted by Elizabeth, who said she had attended a meeting that day. It seemed that annoying person had also sent a letter to Lady Anne. George dropped his fork on the spot. Elizabeth continued. She said she really wanted to see that bastard's face. She wondered which Viscount could do such a thing. He must be a difficult person who, unable to gain respect, resorts to such dirty tricks to get attention. Just then, George jumped up from the table, saying he had an upset stomach and had to leave. Elizabeth immediately ran after him, while Rihanna watched them go, simply smiling slyly. A short while later, the girl came to her lover's room. He was sitting there quietly, lost in thought. So Liz asked him why he was so tense today. George said someone knew about them and handed her the note from the bouquet. Liz was very unhappy, pointing out how shameless it was for some stranger to send such a letter. George was sure it was Pekin's, only he would do something so rotten, and he tried to put him down today. Maybe he sent the bouquet because George had taken the position that Pecans was supposed to get. In a fit of rage, the man kicked over the table. Elizabeth begged him to calm down and not do anything rash. First, they needed to find out where the flowers were sent from and identify the sender. She said she would go to the Ministry of Finance tomorrow to get the flower basket and take it to the flower market. The man held her tightly, saying she was everything to him in this world. Then Liz grabbed the letter and threw it into the fireplace, saying they would face this together. A glint appeared in her eye as she said there was nothing to worry about. They would be fine. The next morning, Rihanna helped her husband get ready for work and wished him a good day. After he left, Elizabeth came over and asked where her brother-in-law had gone. Then she took George's insignia from a maid, saying he had forgotten it again. Rihanna was surprised it had happened again, but she said Margaret would deliver the insignia to the Ministry of Finance. But Liz said that if the maid showed up there again, George's colleagues would start gossiping about him being a slob. Then she said she could run the errand herself, as a favor to her sister. Rihanna smiled at her twin sister's thoughtfulness and let her go to the Ministry of Finance. Liz got there quickly, took the flower basket, and George praised her for coming up with a solution. Afterward, she headed for the exit, but in the hallway, she ran into the most unexpected person. It was the emperor himself, and he turned straight toward her. Liz immediately bowed to greet the ruler, who said it was the first time he had seen her. So she introduced herself as Elizabeth of a Norton family. Alexander was surprised that she was the sister of Countess Royden. He pointed out that although they were twins, they didn't look much alike. Liz was passable, but she was a far cry from Rihanna. If RIA and the Count were to separate, I imagine her family would support her. Then the man asked what brought her to the ministry. Regarding Count Royden, Liz said something had come up this morning and they couldn't reach the Count, so she had come in her sister's place. The emperor then wished Lady Royden a safe journey and went about his business. Walking down the hallway, he thought that dealing with a cheating husband was too much trouble. Rihanna shouldn't have to go through this. That evening, Arai told her husband he had forgotten his insignia at home again, and Elizabeth had gone to great trouble to deliver it to the Ministry of Finance. But the girl said it was nothing, and that she had even met the emperor on the way. Rihanna was surprised that her sister had run into the ruler. Liz said that as soon as he heard her name, he immediately recognized her as George's sister-in-law. George himself said he had also had an audience with the emperor yesterday. His Majesty had come to see him personally. Rihanna looked at her husband skeptically, but Elizabeth immediately started praising George, saying he would be promoted soon at this rate. The man asked his wife what she thought, and R.I. said it seemed the emperor was testing him and showing genuine interest in him. George was convinced it was all due to his outstanding abilities, and that he would soon make the Marquis see him in a new light. Rihanna wondered what the emperor's purpose was, coming for George personally. Could it be that he was going to all this trouble because of her? She remembered him saying he was always ready to help her. Her face flushed red, and she quickly tried to banish those improper thoughts from her mind. After dinner, Liz went to her maid to give another order, but the girl didn't understand why she had to do it. She declared she was not Lady Elizabeth's puppet and wanted to know the reason for the order. She wondered why she had to find out which shop the flower basket was bought from. Then Liz handed her the note from the flowers. The maid was confused about where the note came from, as she had made all the servants keep their mouths shut. Elizabeth approached the girl, saying she would soon be the mistress of this house, so she shouldn't be insolent because she was not as tolerant as her sister. So the maid apologized to the lady, and soon she was left alone. The girl picked up the note, wondering who had done it. It was all filled with hatred and malice. Could Rihanna have done this? Soon, the girl arrived at the flower market with a flower basket. The flower girl confirmed that these were indeed their flowers. The maid then asked for the buyer's name, as her master wanted to send flowers in return. But the blonde flower girl said she didn't know who sent them. A young maid had come to buy them. It turned out the order came from a noble family. The first person the girl thought of was Rihanna's maid, Margaret. Then the flower girl said she remembered something the buyer had said. It was said to be a welcome gift for a newcomer to the department and had to be made with sincerity. Moreover, the sender's name had to be kept secret to avoid embarrassing the recipient. Hearing this, George immediately thought of pecans. He swore to make his superior pay as soon as he got the chance. Just then, a servant announced that the Countess had arrived at the mansion. Liz said she would go greet her and told George to calm down. The man was left alone with the maid, and he wondered when Pecans had found out about his relationship with Elizabeth. The maid thought the superior was just trying to mess with George's mind. If he had real proof, he would have already blackmailed him for hush money. Still, the Count was lucky that the mastermind behind this wasn't his wife. George just sneered, saying Rihanna wouldn't do something like this. If she knew, there was no way she could sit calmly at the same table with him. If she wanted revenge, she would never use such a low-class method. So the maid apologized for her impertinence, but she couldn't help but ask why the young master had chosen Lady Elizabeth of all people. She knew that after a few years of marriage, the spark could fade and the Count hadn't married for love in the first place. But she was still curious why he chose Elizabeth out of all women. Then George said that she had made the first move, and he saw no reason to refuse her. The maid pointed out that Elizabeth was the Countess's sister and could possibly spill the beans. George laughed and replied that the safest affair was with a married woman. She had to be careful not to get caught, or everything would fall apart, because one mistake would always drag the other person down too. It's the same with Elizabeth. She won't do anything stupid, because no one would suspect a brother-in-law and sister-in-law of sleeping together. Besides, the forbidden feeling is really exciting, and because she looks so much like his wife, it's much more thrilling than messing around with any random woman. The maid looked at him with disgust, wondering when he had become such a scumbag, as she had been with him since he was a child. A short while later, the maid went to find the other servants and asked why Margaret hadn't been seen for a while. They told her she had family matters to attend to, and the Countess had given her a day off. The girl thought the Countess was probably telling the truth, and the Count was right too. If Lady Rihanna knew about all this, she wouldn't let it go. Meanwhile, Margaret met with the flower girl, stuffed a bag of gold coins in her hand, and thanked her for saying exactly what was required. The girl also said the flowers for the funeral would be ready soon. Margaret was counting on her. It was a very important matter. A short while later, the maid returned to the mansion and told Rihanna that all preparations were proceeding as planned. The girl smiled with satisfaction and said there was something else to be done. She wanted to go all out for the funeral and her revenge. Just then, George burst into her room. He was furious that Marquis Pecans was on the guest list. Was his wife really going to invite that villain to his father's memorial service? Rihanna explained that Pecans was his superior and couldn't be left uninvited. But George refused to yield. She pulled her hand back, insisting that Pecans must be invited. These words sent the Count into a rage. He said he didn't want to see him in his own house. He He stormed past his wife, deliberately bumping her shoulder, and slammed the door on his way out. George immediately went to find Elizabeth, but she also told him to calm down. The man wouldn't let it go, convinced that Pecans was the mastermind behind the flower incident. But Liz said that was precisely why he needed to get close to his superior and find his weakness. If George acted friendly and discovered his weakness, he wouldn't be able to bother him anymore. Then the man asked what weakness a snake like Pecans could possibly have. Elizabeth hugged him and said everyone has a weakness, and her own weakness was George. The man agreed, saying Rihanna could invite Pecans over. Meanwhile, on the day of the memorial service, Margaret was helping her mistress dress for the ceremony and noticed that Rihanna seemed lost in thought. She knew this was her last chance to choose between family harmony and revenge. It would be too late to change her mind tomorrow. But she wasn't afraid. On the contrary, she was looking forward to it. So the choice felt like a joke to her. Soon, the mistress went outside to greet the guests. Lady Pringe commented that the scene looked much grander this year, and everyone knew it was all thanks to Lady Rihanna. Then the guests wondered where Count Royden himself was. Rihanna thought she had just seen him, so she excused herself, saying she was going to look for her husband. The girl returned to the mansion and walked through the empty hallways. Just then, George's maid, Bennigan, stopped her. She said the man was in the garden now. Rihanna noticed the girl's hands were trembling uncontrollably, so she told her she was going up to the second floor to get something from her room. Bennigan was about to offer to go herself, but Rihanna told her to get back to work. Once on the second floor, the girl closed the door behind her and took off her shoes to move silently. She tiptoed very slowly. Suddenly, Rihanna heard a sound like a moan. She peeked around the corner and saw her husband and sister making out against the wall. Elizabeth wondered if this was really the best place to be intimate with so many guests in the mansion, including those peacocks. But George quickly assured her that they were among friends here. The girl smiled and agreed with her lover, about to throw herself into his arms. Just then, Rihanna crept up behind the couple and raised her shoe. With a sharp blow, the girl's dress was splattered with her husband's blood. Bleeding, George collapsed onto Elizabeth like a lifeless weight. The girl looked at her sister in horror, still holding her lover's body. The next second, she dodged sharply to the side, dropping George onto the floor. But Rihanna didn't let her escape. A second later, she was standing over her sister, ready to strike again with her blood-soaked shoe. But this was all just the girl's imagination. In reality, she never came out from around the corner, just listened silently as her husband and Elizabeth had their fun. So Rihanna headed for the exit, thinking that now was not the time for revenge. They should really enjoy this moment, she thought, because it would be their last chance. Coming downstairs, Arai ran into Bennigan again. She let her know that she had gotten what she needed and that all preparations were complete. Soon, George appeared at the ceremony, saying he was late because he had made a detour to the mansion. Rihanna just glared at her husband, not even bothering to respond to his nonsense. A short while later, the ceremony was announced to begin. George greeted everyone present. He said that thinking of his beloved father, he once again felt the incredible pain of loss. With that, he handed the microphone to his wife, Countess Royden. Before starting her speech, the girl scanned the guests and noticed Elizabeth in the crowd. Marquis Pecans was also present at the ceremony. Then Rihanna said that her husband's father had been a very good man who loved her as his own daughter. George and Elizabeth exchanged a look and smiled mischievously. But Rihanna continued, saying she still felt guilty about the late Count's final wish. She announced that she had not yet fulfilled his last wish. George was confused and whispered to his wife, asking what last wish she was talking about. Rihanna said that last night, her angry father-in-law had appeared in her dream, insisting that she grant his request immediately. She realized she was wrong and therefore wanted to do it now. She quickly introduced a young man to the guests. He was Joseph Royden, the late Count's second son. He was her husband's trustworthy younger brother. Just then, she flashed back to the day her husband's father died. He had told her there was something only Rihanna could know. The old man confessed that besides George, he had another son. 15 years ago, driven by alcohol, he had made a big mistake. His mistress had given birth to a son, but she couldn't bear to tell his wife, so she had no choice but to disappear into the countryside with the child. Just then, the old man grabbed Rihanna's hand, saying that if he died, there would be no one to look after them. George knew nothing about it, because if he found out, all hell would break loose. The old man begged Rihanna to take care of them until his other son came of age. He He made her promise to carry out his request. Only the two of them knew the secret. Just then, the man handed Rihanna a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant split in two. He said the child would have the other half as proof that they were family. The man said it was his dying wish, and he had no one else to entrust it to. But Arai didn't even have a chance to answer, because the man passed away. The girl stood by her father-in-law's bed, gazing at the pendant. She had said she would protect her husband no matter what, and asked for his understanding. But now, at the man's memorial service, standing with his other son, she decided to finally fulfill his request. Rihanna said that 3 years ago, she was too scared to do as he asked. But now she would gather her courage and take care of Joseph. Just then, George jumped up like a madman and screamed at his wife. He pointed at the boy and ordered her to throw the little bastard out immediately. Rihanna tried to calm him down, reminding him that Joseph was his brother, even if they were half-brothers. This only enraged George further, and he yelled at her that she had no right to speak to him like that. His wife told him to consider his reputation as an official, especially with Marquis Pecans present at the ceremony. But George didn't care. He grabbed his brother by the collar and ordered him to get out of his house. Rihanna intervened again, saying he couldn't say such things to a child. Just then, George raised his hand, saying he didn't consider that lowlife his brother. Rihanna stepped between them, and the slap meant for Joseph landed on her instead. The boy immediately steadied her by the shoulders and asked if she was all right. All the guests were stunned by what had just happened, and it took George a few seconds to realize what he had done. Then Rihanna said she understood her husband was upset and that he could take it out on her if he needed to. But the child was innocent. George completely lost control, shouting that there was no way to prove they were brothers, because who knew where he had crawled out from? Just then, Arai took out a pendant, saying Joseph had the other half. They put the two halves together, forming a picture of a young woman. But for George, this proof was not enough. He snatched the pendant from his brother's hand and threw it on the ground, shattering it. The man said he would never give that little pest a single penny. He would not respect their father's last wish, especially when he had spent his whole life chasing women. Rihanna tried to stop him, saying he couldn't say such things at his father's memorial service, especially not in front of everyone who had come to pay their respects. Then George screamed that the memorial service was over and told everyone to get out. After that, he turned and walked away, leaving his wife and brother standing there. Rihanna smiled slyly, because everything was going exactly according to plan. When the couple returned to the mansion, George was still shouting nonstop, not understanding how his wife could do such a thing without consulting him first. If she loved him even a little, she should have at least told him her plan beforehand. Just then, Rihanna said she knew how her husband would have reacted if she had told him everything beforehand. He would have tried to cause trouble for the boy, which was exactly what his father had feared. George yelled that he didn't care about his father's will, but Arai reminded him that according to the law in Istrachi, illegitimate children had inheritance rights. But the man walked right past her, deliberately bumping her shoulder, and said that was impossible. He stormed into the mansion, leaving his wife alone. Just then, Joseph walked over to Rihanna and asked if he could sit with her. So the girl had Margaret bring the boy some tea and dessert. Joseph knew the lady was in trouble because of him, but Arai assured him that everything was fine. She said all of this was so that he could become the second son of the Royden family. The young man awkwardly thanked Rihanna, but she said she was just carrying out his father's last wish. But Joseph didn't think she had sought him out because of the will, otherwise she would have shown up 3 years ago. Arai confirmed this, then asked him why he hadn't come to them in George after his mother passed away last year, when he was clearly having a hard time. But before Joseph could answer, his older brother suddenly came up behind him and poured a glass of water right over his head. He yelled at the servants to throw this little pest out immediately. Rihanna's face immediately darkened. She declared that Joseph had Royden blood in him, and the servants had no right to lay a single finger on him. Then George yelled that if they didn't get rid of him, he would do it himself. The man raised his hand to slap his brother's face, but he blocked it just in time with a tray. George roared at the little bastard's audacity. Then Joseph, with a sly smile, told his brother to calm down. The Count almost yelled that they weren't brothers, but the guy continued, saying he was definitely related by blood to the late Count Royden and wasn't yet of age, so he was staying in the mansion. Rihanna backed the boy, saying she would let him use the entire 4th floor. George exploded, yelling that Elizabeth was using that floor. He declared that a man and a girl couldn't live on the same floor. It wasn't proper. Rihanna gave a nervous laugh and said that Elizabeth lived with them, but nothing was going on between her and George. The young man faltered. He had no choice but to agree. Then Rihanna ordered a servant to take Joseph to his room. Just then, Liz burst into the hall, shouting that she didn't want to live on the same floor as this barbarian. Rihanna said that, unlike George, she had no right to speak that way, and she herself was a newcomer to this mansion. Liz was only living here because of her sister's generosity, but if she didn't like it, she could leave at any time, and Rihanna wouldn't stop her. After that, the girl walked out of the room, ignoring her husband's fury. He yelled at her, retreating back, telling her not to forget who her real family was. But Arai didn't react at all. A little later, she decided to visit Joseph in his new room. The girl said that the guy would stay there and wait for her instructions, and if he was obedient, all the property of this house would become his. Joseph smiled. He decided to explain why he had laid low for the past 3 years. He was waiting to come of age, because it's hard for a minor without parents to win a lawsuit, and his brother would do everything to use that to cut his legal inheritance. Rihanna commented that it was a rather clever plan, but she immediately added that it wasn't her problem, and now the guy needed to rest. His work for the day was done. Joseph just smiled and watched the lady until she disappeared behind the door. The next morning, the guy was having breakfast with his newly acquired family and greeted his older brother. He said that no matter what, George was his dearest and only older brother. The Count stood up from the table, saying he wouldn't sit at the same table as that little bastard. Then Elizabeth turned to Rihanna and said that if George found his company so unpleasant, Joseph should eat in his room. Rihanna simply replied that her sister ate at the same table with them, and if they were to disrespect George's brother, it would be disrespectful to George himself. Liz was furious at this response. She angrily slammed her cutlery on the table, then stood up from her seat and walked silently toward the exit. After a brief silence, Joseph apologized for ruining breakfast, but Arai said that wasn't the case at all. Just then, Margaret poured the young man some wine, while the Countess said she hoped for more fruitful collaborations with him in the future. Joseph said he could have just sat quietly and received his inheritance, but since his sister-in-law had other ideas, he was happy to stir things up a bit. Soon, the guests gathered at the hotel again, and George watched unhappily as his younger brother reveled in all the benefits that came with his inheritance. Rihanna apologized for that day, saying it was all her fault, and asked the guests to forget what her husband had said. The guests were simply stunned that the Countess, despite her own suffering, had the courage to carry out the late Count's will. Then, the lady said that the most important thing to her was that an innocent child was not harmed. Someone suggested he might sow discord in their family, but Araya replied that if her husband had known about the child beforehand, he would not have spared him, so she had to remain silent. Once Joseph came of age, he would likely lay claim to the Royden family's fortune, and George would not let his brother, who had tarnished the family's honor, live. So Arai decided she had to take drastic measures, but doing so had caused trouble for the guests, for which she apologized again. Realizing that people were on her side, the lady smiled slyly, saying that George was her beloved husband and she would take responsibility for him. Shortly after, Rihanna met with the emperor, who admired the countess's actions. He said that in high society, Count Royden was considered a monster, while Rihanna was known as a devoted wife who cared for her husband. But Alexander himself believed she was not a woman who would let things go. Arai agreed, and then handed him documents proving George's embezzlement. Alexander was excited by this news and began to look through the documents with great interest. Rihanna said that after being betrayed by the one she loved, she decided she had to become even more flawless. The emperor said he had heard that Count Royden had laid a hand on her, but she said that was nothing compared to what she was feeling at that moment, and then asked the ruler to use the documents as wisely as possible. Just then, Alexander reached out and touched her cheek with his fingers. Arai looked at him in surprise, and he quickly apologized and withdrew his hand. He said he wanted to check the wound and found it was a bit more serious than he had heard. The emperor added that he would send her some court medicine, as she needed a healthy body for her revenge. After all, he and Rihanna were now in a business partnership, and he would not take no for an answer. The woman thanked him for his help, saying she would get rid of her husband as soon as Alexander had everything arranged. The man commented that filing for divorce, just as her husband was completely ruined, would be a chef's kiss of perfection. He promised to let her know the exact timing soon, and all of this was overheard by the emperor's advisor. Rihanna thanked the ruler and took her leave. As she was leaving, she bumped into a red-haired man. The moment she stepped out of the office, the man rushed to the emperor, saying he needed to go to the temple immediately. It was said that this was the first time in 30 years that the oracle had delivered a prophecy. The oracle was essentially a god, and the priests helped convey his will to the people, and his prophecies were always true. The priests of the temple greeted the emperor, who was their second master after the gods. Then, the man said he wanted to know what the divine revelation was. The priest said it was related to the next emperor of Age. Alexander was shocked. He wasn't even married yet, and the gods had already sent an omen. The man explained that for an emperor without an empress, this was the most practical kind of prophecy. But the rulers still didn't understand what he was talking about. Meanwhile, the Norden sisters went to visit their father, who was very happy to be reunited with his daughters after so long. He had heard there was a commotion after the memorial service, and the fact that George hadn't come here with his wife meant he was still holding a grudge. Rihanna then said she was fine and that George would cool down soon. But the old man didn't understand why his eldest daughter was doing all this, and Elizabeth chimed in, saying that Ri had been acting strangely lately. She ordered her to live on the same floor as a strange man and said she was just a guest in their palace. Ri said she would explain everything later. Liz thought her sister's health problems were just getting to her. Their father became very agitated upon hearing this, but Rihanna quickly reassured him, saying she was just tired from preparing for the memorial service. But Liz wouldn't let it go, constantly asking if she was in pain or feeling dizzy. So Ri apologized and said she needed to step away for a moment. She went to the washroom, leaned over the sink, and tried to catch her breath and calm herself. Just then, Liz appeared behind her, asking what was wrong and if she had a stomach bug or something. She put her arm on Rihanna's shoulder, saying they could go home now if she wanted. She thought to herself why her sister was in such a hurry to leave, probably wanting to start poisoning her again. Then Liz asked if Ria was angry because she had complained to their father, explaining it was just a joke. She again suggested they return to the table, saying their father was getting worried. Rihanna said he was getting weaker by the day due to his illness, and Elizabeth should cherish the time he was still alive. She thought to herself that as long as their father was alive, she wouldn't touch her sister. But the moment he breathed his last, her good days would be over. When the sisters returned to the table, the man asked his eldest daughter if she was all right. But Ri quickly assured him that she was fine now. Just then, a servant entered the room and said a letter from the imperial palace had arrived. When a man finished reading the letter, he dropped his cutlery in shock. The sisters were completely bewildered, having no idea what the letter said. Then the man announced that the emperor had sent a marriage proposal. Rihanna couldn't believe her ears. He was really getting married? But to whom? The oracle's prophecy was very clear. The heir to the throne must come from the bloodline of the North. The emperor was caught off guard. Rihanna was already married, though of course, she might get a divorce soon. But she had a husband now. Then the man dropped the bombshell. The letter was for Elizabeth. They wanted to make her the empress. Rihanna couldn't believe her ears. Her heart sank. Liz, on the other hand, was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming the most important woman in the empire. The girl's father was confused as to why the emperor would choose Lisbeth over some outstanding girl from a powerful family, especially since she had broken off an engagement 4 years ago. Then the girl ran to the man, saying the emperor had fallen in love with her at first sight. She explained that she was on her way to the treasury when she met the emperor, and he even asked for her name. Liz added that it was all thanks to her sister, as she had gone to the treasury on her sister's behalf. Rihanna asked in a trembling voice if their father would agree to the marriage, and Liz interjected that it was a no-brainer. The girl forced a nervous smile and said she was in no position to question the emperor's decision. It was unheard of to refuse such a title, so she told her father to give the ruler a reply as soon as possible. The man caressed Lizzie's cheek, saying he never thought their family would receive such an honor, and congratulated his daughter on her upcoming engagement. He hugged her, saying her late mother would have been overjoyed to witness this important moment. Meanwhile, Rihanna was struggling to contain her emotions, her whole body trembling with despair. Just then, the emperor's advisor decided to ask him if he really intended to marry Miss Norden. The man said the oracle's word was law. If Elizabeth Norden married another man, the next emperor would be a traitor who would seize the throne by eliminating Alexander. If Prince Albert found out about the prophecy, he would surely try to win Elizabeth's heart, so we must keep it secret. The advisor then asked what the ruler intended to do about the Countess of Norden, because if she had a child with the Count, it would only make matters worse. But the emperor said that wouldn't happen, as she would soon be divorcing her husband. The advisor was surprised, saying that was an even bigger problem, because she could remarry Prince Albert, which would mean the birth of a future traitor. So he suggested the emperor marry Rihanna as well. It was not without precedent in the imperial family, but Alexander said he did not want to marry Rihanna Royden. It wasn't just because she was already married. He also wasn't sure if he could be a good husband to her. She had already been through one bad marriage, and forcing her into another with someone she didn't even love would be too cruel. The advisor tried to convince the ruler that this was no time for such considerations, as the oracle had prophesied a rebellion. The emperor then announced that he would forbid Rihanna from remarrying or having children. He would announce the prophecy on the day of his wedding to Elizabeth, which would serve as a solid reason for his decision. But the advisor pointed out that it was too risky. If the prophecy leaked, Prince Albert would get his hands on Rihanna one way or another. Alexander then said that he and the Countess had already agreed to cooperate, and she knew full well what would happen if she betrayed him. Just then, a servant entered the emperor's office and announced that the Countess of Royden requested an audience. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, thrilled by the latest news, was getting dolled up in her room. George walked into her room, saying he had really missed her. He asked how her meeting with her father went, then mentioned how beautiful she looked, assuming she had dressed up for him. The young man touched his beloved's shoulder, but Liz immediately stood up and told him to take his hands off her. The girl coldly told George that things needed to end between them. The guy didn't understand why she was suddenly dropping this bombshell, especially when Rihanna had just disrespected him, and now Elizabeth was spouting nonsense too. But then the girl said she already had someone else. Liz smiled smugly and declared they were over, and that her soon-to-be brother-in-law should focus his attention on Rihanna. Just then, the guy roughly grabbed her shoulders, yelling that he wouldn't let her go. But Elizabeth just said coldly that he shouldn't come anymore and that she was planning to move in with her father. George squeezed her hand with all his might, shouting that he wouldn't let her go anywhere. Liz smiled smugly, asking how he thought he was going to stop her. The Count then threatened to expose their little secret, after which no decent man would ever want to touch Elizabeth. Meanwhile, the Emperor's maid announced that he was ready to see Rihanna. As soon as he entered the room, the girl gave the ruler a brief curtsy. The man said he knew why the Countess had come, and RIA decided to cut to the chase and ask why the Emperor had decided to marry her sister. The Emperor replied without hesitation that he had fallen in love with her at first sight. But noticing the terrible expression on Rihanna's face, he quickly added that he was just kidding. The girl said that the position of Empress was a prestigious one, not something one could just walk into. Northerners didn't have that much influence, and Rihanna's father had no connections in politics. So if the Emperor was playing some political game, she couldn't see how her family could possibly help him achieve it. Alexander then pointed out that RIA seemed vehemently opposed to her sister becoming Empress, and she confirmed his suspicion, saying it could never happen. The Emperor was curious about what she meant by that. Just then, Rihanna dropped the bombshell. The woman who was intimate with George was none other than her sister, Lisbeth. The Emperor and his advisor were stunned. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. But RIA wouldn't lie about something like this. The Emperor knew that too. She pleaded with him to withdraw the proposal, if only for his own sake. But he said he couldn't do that right now and couldn't explain why. Rihanna then leaned over the Emperor's desk, her breath almost on his neck. She needed to know just when he would be able to tell her the reason. But unfortunately for her, Alexander said he would only reveal it after he married Elizabeth. Rhea immediately cried out that it would be too late by then. Alexander said calmly that Miss Norden was destined for a miserable marriage. He could guarantee it. But Rihanna didn't care about that. She would never stand by and watch Elizabeth become Empress, standing by His Majesty's side, even if it cost her her life. She said that if the Emperor insisted on this wedding, she would expose all of her sister's dirty secrets. The ruler was displeased that the Countess was speaking to him in such a tone. If she made an enemy of him, she wouldn't stand a chance. But RIA simply said that the Emperor shouldn't make an enemy of her either, because there was nothing more dangerous than a woman with nothing to lose. A tense silence hung between them, neither willing to back down from their goals. The Emperor then ordered the Countess to return to her estate and think everything over with a clear head. Rihanna said she needed 3 days and asked him to halt the wedding preparations during that time. The emperor agreed, and the girl promised to visit him in 3 days. When the countess and Margaret returned to the hotel, the maid asked her mistress what she planned to do. She was going to find out why the emperor wanted to marry Elizabeth and then get rid of her at all costs. Meanwhile, Liz and George were still arguing. She told him that if the truth about them came out, Rihanna would finish him off directly. George said he would get on his knees and say she seduced him and he had no choice, but Rihanna would never forgive such a betrayal from her own sister. George declared he wouldn't let Liz dump him and run off with another man. Then she gave a twisted smile and said she was just annoyed and decided to lie about it. She was just hurt because George had been so cold to her lately. Liz hugged the Count, telling him there was no other man. Then she sent him back to his room, as RIA could return at any moment. George wished his beloved good night and told her he loved her. She said she loved him too, then closed the door behind him. Walking down the hallway, the Count was angry, unable to figure out what was going on. Liz had ruined his mood with that little trick. A little later, Bennigan's came to George's room, surprised that he was still awake. In her opinion, the Count had been very tense lately, so she had brewed him some calming tea. The guy was about to drink it all in one go, but stopped at the last second, saying he was going to drink it slowly over a long time, so Bennigan's could leave first. So the girl obediently left the room, wishing the Count a good night. As soon as the maid disappeared behind the door, George poured the tea down the drain, staring at the contents of the cup and trembling with fear. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was relaxing in her room, as if waiting for her lover to drink the potion. The next morning, the girl was preening in front of the mirror when Rihanna walked in. She said she had an audience with the emperor, and Liz then asked what they met for. The Countess pointed out that her sister looked very excited. Rihanna replied that she couldn't help it, as she was about to become Empress. RIA then pressed on, asking Liz to confess how she had met the emperor at the treasury. The girl paused, racking her brain, not knowing what to say. The emperor had asked if Rihanna had put her up to it. To be honest, the whole meeting had been rather unremarkable. Elizabeth thought to herself that since the emperor had a favorable impression of George, he might have taken an interest in her as well, or maybe he had just fallen for her at first sight. Rihanna fell silent, mulling over her sister's words in her mind. Then Liz grabbed her hand, pleading with her to visit often once she became Empress. When Rihanna returned to her room, she told Margaret that her sister knew nothing. The proposal wasn't her doing. Then she wondered if the emperor had simply made a calculated decision. His Majesty would never willingly choose a woman who was intimate with her own brother-in-law to be his empress. For something like that to happen, a force more powerful than the emperor was needed. Just then, a thought crossed Rian's mind. She needed to make a donation to the temple. When she arrived there, the high priest personally thanked her for her large donation. RIA said that something important had happened, so she wanted to thank the big man upstairs. The priest asked what she was talking about, and that's when she explained that her twin sister was about to become the empress. She said she had heard all about it from the emperor himself, so there was no need to hide it from her. After all, Rian already knew that her sister was the woman from the prophecy. The priest was surprised that the emperor would leak a secret like that. Right then, Rian knew her guess was spot on. She figured the ruler probably saw no need to hide it, since they would soon be family. But one question bothered her. Was there a way to get around this whole prophecy business? Rihanna explained her question by saying she was just very worried about her only sister. The priest then asked if the Countess was consumed by jealousy of the Lord's plan. The girl replied curtly that she had said nothing of the sort. The man replied that she shouldn't even think that way. She should be glad that she and the Count had no children, as his birth would have been an omen of great turmoil. Rihanna slowly began to understand. The divine revelation wasn't about the Empress, but about the next emperor. The woman in the prophecy wasn't just Elizabeth. The child of one of the sisters would become the next emperor. RIA then struggled to hide her trembling body, smiling as she said she would never oppose the Lord's plan. Back home, the Countess was acting strangely, so Margaret asked if something terrible had happened. Rihanna smiled and said that maybe the big man upstairs hadn't completely forgotten about her after all. The maid knew nothing, after all, so the girl rushed over and grabbed her shoulders. She said she needed to see the emperor at once. Alexander was surprised they were meeting so soon, but Rihanna happily announced that she had found the answer ahead of schedule. Before the emperor could react, she directly asked him to make her his empress. She said she would make everything His Majesty wanted a reality. Neither Alexander nor his advisor had expected this. The emperor then said that the Countess of Royden was the only person to ever try to marry the emperor himself, and as a second marriage at that. The girl declared that she was prepared to do whatever it took to stop her sister from becoming empress. The ruler then asked if she was sure she could bear him a child. Rihanna thought to herself that given they were both still young, getting pregnant shouldn't be too difficult. The emperor rephrased his question, asking if the countess was willing to share his bed. "All right," said His Majesty, was the most charming man in the empire, and no woman could refuse him. But Alexander clarified that he was asking about her specifically. The girl replied that she would be the best choice for empress. They couldn't have the heir's mother be, how should one put it, tainted. Her feelings on the matter were irrelevant. The emperor then said he felt sorry for her, which was why he cared. He walked up behind her and asked if she wanted to leave everything behind and start over with a better man. Rihanna simply said that His Majesty wouldn't understand, because the moment she discovered her husband fooling around with her own sister, she had already died inside. If Elizabeth ascended to the throne, it would be impossible for Rihanna to live happily. The problem was, the emperor said he couldn't grant her wish. If he made Rihanna the empress, Prince Albert would immediately snatch up Elizabeth. That left only one option, to publicly announce the divine revelation and marry both sisters. Rhea agreed, but on the condition that the emperor would later strip Elizabeth of her title so that no one could marry her again. After the demotion, Alexander had no reason to object. He agreed to make Rihanna the empress and take Miss Norton as his wife. But the girl needed to get a divorce as soon as possible, because even for him, marrying a married woman was complicated. Rihanna promised to do everything in her power to avoid causing the ruler any trouble. However, she had one more request, perhaps a selfish one. She asked the emperor to ensure that Elizabeth would not get pregnant with his child. Seeing the confused look on the countess's face, the man quickly assured her that it wouldn't happen. Rihanna said Elizabeth would stop at nothing to steal her man, so the ruler needed to be extra careful. The emperor then decided to ask the lady for a favor as well. He wanted her to promise not to betray him, no matter what. If she didn't join forces with Prince Albert, he wouldn't stab her in the back either. But if he did, Rihanna knew how to deal with him. And if the countess betrayed him, the emperor also knew what to do with her. They both knew where the other's weaknesses lay, so scheming against each other simply wasn't worth it. Rihanna was very satisfied with this arrangement. The emperor then said he would wait for her to finalize the divorce as soon as possible. Although he couldn't say he loved the countess, he could be on her side. And for her, that was enough. The next morning, George had to eat breakfast alone. Bennigan's told him Elizabeth had already left. The guy then asked the woman if she was really on his side, and she said yes. He asked the maid if she had noticed anything strange about Elizabeth lately. Bennigan's went on to say that the young lady had seemed quite flustered lately. Since meeting Count Norton, the young lady had been paying more attention to her appearance, and she was always smiling when she looked in the mirror. The maid thought to herself that something must have happened between the master and the young lady to cause such a reaction. Basically, she meant that Elizabeth was acting like someone head over heels in love, as if she had just started seeing a man. The girl was strolling down the hotel corridor when someone called out to her. It was George. Liz told him she was going to tea party. He wished her a good time and waved goodbye. But as soon as she disappeared behind the door, he went straight to search her room. The guy was convinced she was seeing someone else. But George had no intention of letting Elizabeth go so easily. He was determined to make her his wife. Suddenly, while rummaging through the girl's clothes, he found a letter in a small vial. Next to it, he recognized the pills, the same ones Elizabeth had been giving to Rihanna. George realized his suspicions were correct. He was going to find out who this bastard was and make him pay. The letter bore the imperial seal, and the guy couldn't figure out why they would be writing to Liz. When the count opened the letter, his face twisted in shock. It was a marriage proposal from His Majesty. Elizabeth was going to be the empress. George laughed nervously. Now he understood why she wanted to break up, but he wasn't going to let that happen. He tidied up her room, putting everything back in its place, and then left. Soon, night fell, and Elizabeth returned to her room. Suddenly, a figure in the far corner of the room called out to her. It was George. He asked how the tea party went. She just said it was fine, and then he told her Rihanna would be back late tonight. He walked over to Elizabeth and put his arm around her waist, but she pushed him away, saying she was tired. But George persisted, asking her to take off her clothes so he could give her a massage, but Liz refused that too. So the Count tried to guilt trip her, saying they hadn't been intimate in a long time, and now Rihanna had brought Joseph here, making his situation even more difficult. He moved closer to her, telling her he really needed her support, while slowly starting to remove her clothes. Finally, Liz began to respond to him, and George immediately pounced on her, embracing her and saying how much he loved her. He kissed her, continuing to remove her clothes, and then laid her on the bed. The whole time, George was thinking that he would never let Elizabeth leave him. She wouldn't escape his grasp, nor would she become Empress. Instead, she would carry his child. The Count smiled slyly, asking the girl to be with him forever. Back at work, George was in high spirits. Perkins was surprised because he had been in low spirits before, but now he was grinning like a Cheshire cat. The Count then said that the thought of being able to work in the treasury just really cheered him up. That's why he looked so happy. As he bowed to his boss and left, he thought to himself, let the guy complain all he wants because he didn't care anymore. The only thing on George's mind was the look on Elizabeth's face when she found out she was pregnant. Would she still be dreaming of becoming Empress then? She would probably get rid of Rihanna as soon as possible and then beg him to marry her. But his thoughts were interrupted by his wife. During his lunch break, she came to the Ministry of Finance holding a bouquet of flowers. Rihanna said she went to the flower market, and because she loved the scent of the flowers so much, she accidentally bought too many. George's colleagues all said he was so lucky to have such a thoughtful wife. They asked if the 2 flower baskets were also a gift from the Countess, but she pretended to have no idea what they were talking about. George quickly took his wife outside, saying it was all nonsense. Once outside, Rihanna demanded he explain, and he yelled that Marquis Perkins had found a woman to send the flowers to mess with him, trying to drive a wedge between them as a couple. But she was certain the Marquis wouldn't be so childish, so George roared that she didn't know the old guy at all. Now he was accusing his own wife of cheating, but Rihanna simply smiled in response, saying she hadn't doubted her husband for a second. She embraced him, saying he would never disappoint her. Then she took out a large bag of food, saying it was lunch for the 2 of them. George was surprised, as his wife was always busy with the hotel. But Rihanna said she would always make time for her beloved husband. Shortly after having lunch with his wife, George returned to the Ministry of Finance, where his colleagues were discussing his unfair treatment of his wife, but they immediately fell silent as he walked in. That night, after another night of passion, Elizabeth mentioned the circulating rumors that the Count had a sponsor, a godmother, who sent him flowers and pulled strings to get him his job. George immediately flew into a rage, yelling that he wasn't that pathetic and his job was definitely not thanks to some woman. Then Liz asked what would happen if the rumors reached Rihanna's ears. The Count was certain his wife trusted him, but she pressed on, asking that if he continued to neglect her, she herself might start investigating the rumors. Liz told him to be a little nicer to her sister, to take her out on dates, and give her gifts. More importantly, the palace was holding a masquerade ball soon, and George could buy her a dress for it. The man thanked Elizabeth for the good idea, saying he would buy her a dress too, an even prettier one. Soon, the Count did give his wife a gift, a floor-length red gown. The girl said the dress was perfect for the masquerade ball. Just then, the man came up from behind her, wrapped his arms around her, and told her she would be the most dazzling woman at the party. Rihanna flinched slightly and asked if something was wrong with her husband. He didn't like that question at all. Did he need a reason to love his own wife? Then Rihanna realized he was probably worried about what she thought of the gossip, but she just said that she was truly happy. The girl kissed her husband on the cheek, saying she was lucky to be his wife. What she was really thinking was that, thanks to all this, she would replace Elizabeth as the Empress, and it would be wonderful if George could see her completely break down in agony. Soon, the masquerade ball began, and Rihanna arrived wearing the dress, with a mask that matched it perfectly. Margaret reported that the master was wearing a blue suit with a white bow tie, while Miss Elizabeth was in a pink dress and white shoes. Rihanna gave a smug smile and entered the hall, ready to carry out her plan. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was eavesdropping on others gossiping that Count Roden of the Ministry of Finance was cheating on his wife. They said someone had sent him flowers twice and had also helped him get his job through a recommendation. Then Liz joined the conversation, mentioning that Countess Royden had been married for 4 years, but still had no children. The guests speculated that the girl was infertile, which was why her husband had started messing around on the side. Elizabeth smiled slyly, watching the rumors about her sister's situation spread. Just then, George waved to her from upstairs. He called her to his side. The girl asked if Rihanna would notice them, but the Count assured her that she had gone to the ladies' washroom, and since she was wearing red today, will be easy to spot if anything happened. Then Liz led him into the hall. George was a little worried about the surrounding crowd, but the girl assured him that no one would recognize them here, and that was the charm of this kind of event. The next moment, the couple was lost in dance, oblivious to everyone around them. George said he wanted to kiss the girl, and she suggested they go outside. As soon as they reached the garden, they fell into a passionate kiss. But just then, Elizabeth's heel broke, and she started to fall. George failed to catch her, and she fell right onto the grass, clutching her leg in pain. It seemed she had sprained it badly, so the Count helped Liz up and took her home to call a doctor. All of this was witnessed from a window by a girl in a black dress. The dress had white frills, and it was Rihanna. She had changed her clothes, so her husband wouldn't recognize her at the party. Soon, the Countess returned to the hall and saw a small group of people whispering. She decided to join the conversation, saying she also had something to share with the guests. The Countess announced that rumors about Count Royden's mistress were everywhere, but it seemed no one knew who she was. The guests immediately began to press the girl, wanting to know his mistress's name. Rihanna pretended to be unsure if she should say, but the people kept urging her on, everyone eager to hear the juicy gossip. So the girl revealed that Miss Elizabeth and Count Royden's relationship was, how to put it, very close. The guests were stunned. No one could believe the Count was having an affair with his wife's sister. Rihanna added that all the servants knew, but the Count had made everyone keep their mouths shut. Her maid had told her, you see, she was good friend with a maid from the Royden household, and after a few drinks, that maid spilled all the secrets. The Countess smiled smugly, watching the rumor spread like wildfire through the crowd. Soon, she left the main hall and was walking in a corridor when Rihanna bumped into a man. A blonde, blue-eyed stranger in a blue outfit told her she was stunningly beautiful. He asked if she would honor him with a dance. Rihanna, however, quickly apologized, saying she was just about to leave. But the guy didn't hold her hand too tightly, simply asking for a chance to talk. The Countess said she had to get back to her husband, but he wouldn't give up, saying it was a masquerade ball and no one would even know she was married. Just then, the Emperor walked over, dressed in a black and white formal suit and wearing a mask, and declared that he knew all about her husband. The stranger apologized to the girl for his persistence, and then quickly left. Rihanna asked the monarch how he had recognized her, and he said that while the mask hid her face, she couldn't hide her voice. And she knew it was Alexander, because there weren't many men in the empire who were built like that. The man was flattered and gave a small smile. Rihanna bowed to the monarch, thanking him for helping her out of the situation. But the emperor said that if she had agreed to dance with that guy, it wouldn't have ended well for him either, because that stranger was the monarch's younger brother, Prince Albert. The emperor suspected he hadn't recognized the countess, but had deliberately invited her to dance. More likely, though, he simply couldn't resist Rihanna's beauty. The emperor commented that she was exceptionally charming tonight, and then asked if she would refuse him as well if he would ask her for a dance. Rihanna, realizing her husband was standing right there, took the emperor's hand. She noticed his hand was surprisingly warm. The man smiled smugly, saying that his harsh personality didn't mean his hands had to be cold too. Rihanna, in turn, said that Alexander was a surprisingly good dancer. She had never seen the emperor at social gatherings before, as he found them annoying, especially the women who wanted to become empress. The countess then said that soon he wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. Alexander simply said that some interesting gossip was circulating in the ballroom. Then she told him she had entered the final stage. The man couldn't help but say that was good news, but he wondered if Rihanna would be all right doing this. After all, she would have to marry a man she didn't even like again. Rihanna immediately retorted that the emperor could see what became of her when she married a man she did love. Alexander paused for a moment, then said that being alone wasn't so bad. Some women ruin their lives over a man, but no woman has ever ruined her life by not meeting one. Looking at Rihanna, the man was reminded of someone who had ruined her life by meeting the wrong person. So she asked who he was talking about. The emperor was referring to his own mother, an answer that stunned the countess. He then asked her if she would feel any better after her revenge, if she could spend the rest of her life with a man who didn't love her. But Rihanna told him not to worry, as their agreement had never mentioned love from the start, and she didn't even know what the word meant anymore. She used to believe in it, but now she realized every day how naive she had been. Looking at the ballroom and the people dancing inside, she decided to bid Alexander farewell. Taking off her mask, Rihanna smiled and told him to take care of himself until they met again. After the party, George rushed to his wife, insisting that all the vicious rumors were nonsense. She just calmly sipped her tea, commenting that the tea parties were now all about them. The whole of Ostraci was talking about it. A brother-in-law and a sister-in-law getting together was quite rare, which was why it was causing such a big scandal. Just then, Elizabeth limped into the room on a crutch, her face full of anger, demanding to know what on earth was going on. The girl shouted angrily that someone was spreading terrible lies to ruin her chances of marriage. Rihanna guessed it must be the work of someone who held a grudge against her and George, and he immediately said it was Perkins. The Countess gave a twisted smile, saying the rumors would die down soon and that she would take care of it. George immediately said she was the only one he could trust. After the girl left, Liz asked the Count if he was sure the rumors didn't start from within their own home. Only the staff knew about their affair, but had they all kept their mouths shut? George remembered someone saying that a maid from the Royden household was the source of the rumor. Just then, Bennigan's walked into the room with tea for her masters. The couple glared at the maid, clearly suspecting her of spreading the rumors. The woman immediately cried out that she was innocent, saying she had spent her life following the Count's every command and had even done some very questionable things for him in the past. But Liz had already made up her mind. She said that Mrs. Bennigan's had worked hard all this time, so starting today, she was free to seek other opportunities. The maid rushed to the Count, unable to believe he would do this to her. The man turned to Elizabeth, saying they had no proof that Bennigan's was guilty and that firing her was too rash. At this, Liz said that in that case, they should just replace the entire staff. George was surprised by this, but she said that otherwise they would have to live with potential traitors. Her expression firm, she ordered the Count to fire everyone, not a single one. So the man decided to ask for his wife's opinion, but she also thought it was a good idea. George was stunned that Rihanna would also support this. She explained that the rumors were too detailed to have been fabricated by someone who didn't live in the house, so the source had to be one of their servants. If they couldn't find out who it was, they had no choice but to get rid of them all. With that, she walked out of the room, ignoring her husband's protests. Rihanna was walking down the hall when she ran into Joseph. He asked if she was replacing all the staff for his sake, as if she were looking out for him or something. But Rihanna said it wasn't for him, although he would certainly benefit from it. Joseph smiled, saying he wanted to thank her, but the Countess said there was no need. But the guy insisted, gently taking Rihanna's hand and kissing it, thanking her for her help. Then she gave him a twisted smile and turned to walk away. Joseph asked why she didn't like him. She was too cold to him, but on the first day, she had been very polite. Rihanna replied that he was a guest in a strange place, and she had to treat him well. Joseph then decided to ask her what she planned to do after divorcing his brother. He was curious about her thoughts on remarrying. Rihanna asked who the future husband he was implying was, but the guy evaded the question, saying it could be anyone. It could even be him, as that would be the ultimate revenge against George, getting involved with his younger brother. Rihanna just scoffed, asking if he wanted her to become just like Elizabeth. Joseph tried to explain it was different, as they wouldn't be having an affair, but remarrying. But the Countess still rejected him. She said that he had already made countless enemies just by becoming the master of the mansion as an illegitimate son, and if he then married the former master's wife, he would have even more enemies. She was rejecting him for his own good. He should find someone more sincere and charming than Rihanna. Joseph then gently placed his arm on the girl's shoulder, saying she was already kind and beautiful. Rihanna said the guy knew nothing about her, but he didn't back down, saying he wanted to get to know her better. Looking at him, the Countess felt as if she were seeing a foolish child trying to get involved in a dangerous affair. She remembered the Emperor's words about having to spend her life with a man she didn't love. It made her wonder if Alexander felt the same way. When he looked at her, then Rihanna smiled at Joseph, telling him he would surely find a good woman. The guy was confused. The Countess was his benefactor, and he could never find anyone who could surpass her. But she just advised him to find someone who truly loved him, and then left for good. Meanwhile, George was sitting in his office, furious that his wife and his mistress had forced him to fire all the people who had worked for him their entire lives. He thought to himself that even if the servants had spread the rumors, it wasn't all bad for him, because the chaos meant Elizabeth would never become Empress, just as he wanted. However, if the rumors continued to spread, Rihanna might start to suspect something. Then, the man grabbed a piece of paper and, driven by emotion, quickly wrote something. The next morning, he went to his wife's room. He asked if she was really going to fire everyone. Rihanna said that if he was worried about who would run the house, she could replace the staff gradually. They didn't know who had spread the vicious rumors. So how could they live under the same roof with people they couldn't trust? Then George asked her to at least keep James, his coachman. They had grown up together, and the Count was sure he could be trusted. Rihanna, however, wondered why he chose to keep the coachman specifically and not Mrs. Bennigan's. She decided to agree, and George thanked her for her decision. He also asked her to consider the others, as the servants might not have been the ones who spread the rumors. Meanwhile, a young man came to see the Countess. He introduced himself as Frankie and said he would be working for her starting today. But Rihanna said hiring him wouldn't be easy, as she had intended to fire the coachman, but her husband had insisted on keeping him. Frankie was dejected, thinking he wouldn't be able to work here after all. But the girl told him to calm down, saying he could have the job, but she would need him to do her a favor. She ordered him to watch the coachman named James and report his every move. Soon, the Countess returned to the palace. Elizabeth rushed up to her, asking if people were still talking about the incident. She wanted to know who had started it, who had orchestrated it with the aim of ruining her wedding. Liz was worried the Emperor would believe the rumors. Then Rihanna smiled smugly and said that they had already replaced the staff, so everyone would soon forget about it. Elizabeth was furious. These low-class people had the opportunity to work here, and they repaid her by spreading gossip. Just then, a maid came in and told the girls that the tea party at the Boilargi residence had been canceled. Apparently, someone had received another anonymous letter from that pervert. Elizabeth immediately flared up, saying that Bastard was relentless. But on second thought, she felt that thanks to him, everyone would forget about the gossip. Rihanna watched her sister's genuine joy with suspicion. A while later, the Countess went about her business, and as she got in her carriage, Frankie said that things were much more complicated than he had imagined. The girl didn't understand what he was talking about, so the young man explained that James had left the estate last night. He had followed him. It was around 2 in the morning, and the coachman was surprisingly well-dressed, looking sneaky in the dead of night. The coachman covered his face with his hat. He was heading somewhere, and then he stopped near a mansion. He took a letter out of his cloak and dropped it into the mailbox. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like an envelope. Frankie said James was lurking near the Boilargi mansion. After the Countess returned to the palace, Margaret told her she didn't think James could have done it alone, as the information in the letters was something only a noble would know. She thought Count Royden was the real pervert, but Rihanna said nothing, just sitting in her chair and staring out the window. Suddenly, she burst out laughing, leaving her maid completely confused. The Countess gave a nervous laugh and said that Elizabeth had no idea what a depraved bastard George was. Did she know? She had no idea the letter she received was a fake. But it didn't matter. That wasn't the point. George would deny everything, but Rihanna wasn't going to fall for it. She had originally just wanted to marry Elizabeth off to get rid of her, but now, thanks to this, things are going to get much more interesting. Then Margaret asked what her ladyship planned to do. Rihanna planned to expose George, not just to Elizabeth, but to the whole damn empire, so everyone would know about his twisted fetish. The maid asked if they had any proof, considering he had hidden it for 5 years. But the Countess replied that, even without proof, they could keep digging until he slipped up at the breakfast table. Rihanna said the pervert hadn't stopped, and this time the letter was sent to Lady Boilargi. Elizabeth said the guy who writes that trash is disgusting, a complete coward. Then Rihanna asked her husband for his opinion on the matter. I mean, if he's married, his wife is probably more outstanding than him. So he clearly has some issues, or his woman isn't giving him enough attention. Elizabeth retorted that women despise guys like that, so he couldn't possibly have a partner. She felt sorry for his family, having to live under the same roof with such a bastard, right? Then George jumped up from the table, saying he had something to do and had to leave first. Once back in his room, the Count erupted in a fit of rage. He couldn't believe that Elizabeth had called him a coward when everyone else was afraid of him. It had all started with a small incident 5 years ago. George had been rejected by a girl he'd fallen for at first sight, but after a while, he heard she had married a wealthy marquis. The vain fool had chosen money and status. George had thought she was different, but it turned out she was just like every other woman. She had crushed his pride, so he swore to get his revenge on her. The man gave the letter to James to deliver to the girl, and even the coachman praised how beautifully it was written. The next day, the girl fainted. Fear gripped the empire's high society, and everyone was on guard against the pervert who was sending the letters. George was thrilled that he could influence the nobility even without great wealth or grand plans. He would do it whenever he felt stressed after marrying Rihanna. Whenever he felt he was falling behind her, he would write a letter, and these letters became George's outlet. He thought these women were all ignorant idiots. Now he was preparing to write another letter. Rihanna would be finished in a month anyway, so he decided to write to Elizabeth. George didn't know who had sent her the letter that time. It was clearly the work of an amateur. All he had done was ruin Liz's mood, and that was it. After George's letter was sent, she wouldn't dare show her face outside. She would be afraid of men, and with the rumors flying around, it would be much harder to deal with. That night, the Count had James deliver a letter to Elizabeth. The coachman was confused, as she was his beloved. George then said that this was his revenge for her trying to fire the coachman. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was in her room, where her maid was helping her exercise her injured leg. She was getting better and could now stand on her own without a crutch. Then the maid handed her a letter with no sender's name on it. Elizabeth thought it might be a secret letter from the Emperor. But as soon as she opened the envelope, she knew it wasn't from him. By the time she finished reading the letter, her face was contorted with fear, and her body trembled with fright and a wave of nausea. Immediately after, Liz lost consciousness and fell to the floor. The maids rushed into the room, picked up their lady, and took her to see a doctor. Margaret picked up the letter beside the girl, its contents shocking. The doctor told Rihanna that her sister's fainting was caused by shock, and that she would get better once she calmed down internally. The Countess had some food brought for Liz, but the girl just turned away, saying she wasn't hungry and wanted to be alone. So Rihanna decided to leave, telling her sister to call her if she needed anything. A while later, George walked into Liz's room and asked if she was all right. The girl immediately jumped out of bed, crying that the letter had been sent to her a second time and that she was terrified. Liz knew this pervert knew her well and was watching her, but she didn't know who in her circle could be capable of such a thing. George smiled slyly, then sat down next to his beloved, embracing her and saying he would always be by her side to support her. He touched her lips with his finger, swearing to always protect her from that kind of bastard. But she pushed him away, saying they needed to find out who the culprit was. Elizabeth was planning to talk to Lady Boylargi, and George tried to dissuade her, saying it was too dangerous to go there now. But she left the room in silence, leaving the Count alone. Soon she arrived at the estate, where she and Lady Boylargi realized that the same person had written to both of them. Her letter mentioned a blue dress she had worn at Lady Showbolt's wedding, which was probably when the pervert saw her. Elizabeth frowned. She had also attended that wedding. Lady Boylargi was terrified, realizing that someone had been watching her with malicious eyes that day. Then Liz said that she would definitely make that lowlife pay for what he had done. The girl got serious about the case and did some real investigating. When she was close to solving the mystery, she went to Rihanna and asked if she had taken the letter Elizabeth had received earlier. The Countess said she had thrown it away, as it wasn't something worth keeping, and then wondered why her sister was so interested. Then Liz said she thought the pervert was someone they knew, as all the ladies who received letters were acquainted with the sisters and had attended the same events. Rihanna smiled smugly and suggested they get the guest list to see who was present at every event. Elizabeth begged her to do it, saying her sister was much better connected, and Rihanna agreed. George was hiding in a corner of their room, eavesdropping on their entire conversation. After the girls separated, he went straight to Elizabeth. The man told her to forget about it, but she was sure the lowlife wouldn't stop there, so they had to nip it in the bud. Then George handed her a cup of tea, and Liz drank a few sips without hesitation. George grinned and moved closer to her. Suddenly, she felt dizzy. The cup slipped from her hand, and she collapsed heavily right onto George. He started slapping her face, yelling for her to wake up, begging her to please wake up. When he finally realized Elizabeth wasn't responding, he carried her to the bed and gently covered her with a blanket. Then he grabbed a bottle of ink and poured the entire thing over the table and the letters Liz had been working on. George returned to the girl's side, gently stroking her cheek and thinking that she should have listened to him and stopped earlier. If she had, she wouldn't be unconscious now. Shortly after, the Count went to his wife and told her that Liz was unwell. He said she had been under a lot of stress because of the letters and had refused to rest, so she fainted. The doctor said Elizabeth needed to rest at home for a few days. Rihanna then said she had an appointment that day, so the responsibility of looking after her sister fell to George. After the Count waited for his wife to leave the palace, he headed to Liz's room. The girl was already awake. She was rummaging through her things, asking George if he had seen a letter and some notes that were on the table yesterday. But the man just put his arm around her shoulder, sat her down on the bed, and said she needed to rest and that the letters would turn up eventually. Elizabeth obediently lay down, but she couldn't understand why she had a splitting headache. George said she was just too stressed and gave her a pill to take. Soon, the girl felt the room spinning, and the man pulled her close. Then, George kissed the girl, and after confirming she was completely unconscious, he decided to take advantage of her while she was passed out. Meanwhile, Rihanna arrived at Mrs. Borge's residence and told her about the shocking results of her investigation. The letter and the guest list, all clues pointed to one person, her husband, George Royden. Mrs. Borge couldn't believe it, because Elizabeth had also received a letter. Why would he send something like that to his own sister-in-law? Besides, there had to be a motive behind such a crime. At that moment, Rihanna told Mrs. Borge that she needed to talk to her daughter. It turned out that on the day Mrs. Borge received the letter, Rihanna's driver had seen something suspicious. Frankie came in, and the Countess asked him to describe what he had seen that day. Later, as night fell, Elizabeth was awakened by a strange noise outside. She peeked through the window and saw a strange man trying to break through the servants to get into the mansion. George was also awakened, completely unaware of what was happening. Then, the stranger ordered them to bring out Earl Royd immediately. The Earl recognized him as Duke Ferrez and hurried out to meet him. The Duke asked if there was a servant in the residence named James. George brought the coachman before him and asked Ferrez why he was looking for him. Frankie, standing behind the Duke, said that he was the guy he had seen that night. Before George could say a word, the Duke punched him hard in the face. The Earl fell heavily, landing right at the feet of the enraged Mrs. Borge's father. Elizabeth rushed outside, completely unaware of what was happening. But before she could run to her beloved, Ferrez pounced again, beating George violently. George shouted, trying to calm him down, saying there had been a misunderstanding. But the Duke screamed that he didn't want to hear any explanations from this despicable scoundrel, because he knew it was George who had sent those disgusting letters to his daughter and other nobles. Hearing this, Elizabeth's face showed a look of horror. She couldn't believe it was true. Ferrez said the coachman saw George's servant leave a letter at his house. The Earl quickly argued that James had written the letters himself. The coachman immediately shouted that it was all a lie, that he was just following his master's orders, that all the letters were signed by the Earl, and he was only responsible for delivering them. George screamed with his last bit of strength, refusing to admit his crime. But Ferrez didn't believe him, because an ordinary coachman couldn't write letters of that nature. This indicated that the writer had a close relationship with the families of the victimized noblewomen, and George Royden had attended all the events, so there was no doubt he was the writer. After this, terrible rumors about the daughters of the Norden family were sure to spread. Then, George turned to Elizabeth, grabbed her dress, and screamed that he had nothing to do with it. But the girl angrily slapped his hand away, not wanting to hear his excuses. She turned around and, ignoring the Earl's shouts, ran back into the mansion. Then, Ferrez approached George and asked if he had any other excuses. He gave the Earl a choice: either admit his actions in court and accept the punishment, or settle it with him privately. The Earl thought that if this got out, his reputation would be completely ruined. He would be fired from the treasury, and Rihanna would leave him. So, he knelt down and said to the Duke that this situation could adversely affect the Duke's reputation, that his daughter was still unmarried, and if he went too far with this lad over a small prank, no one would want to marry her. But before he could finish, the Duke kicked him right in the face. The servants were terrified, watching as he beat the Earl to a pulp. They wanted to stop him, but Margaret intervened, saying that if the servants wanted to keep their jobs, they had better shut their mouths. Everyone immediately fell silent, hearing only the sounds of the beating and George's pleas for mercy. Later, Margaret told Rihanna and Ferrez's daughter everything, saying she had barely managed to stop the Duke, fearing he would kill the Earl. The doctor said that George might have certain difficulties with sexual matters and procreation. Bourrienne thought her father had gone too far with the Earl, but Rihanna assured her it was just the normal reaction of a loving father. Rihanna apologized to the girl again for her husband, but the girl understood the Countess was not at fault. She was more worried that the Roydens, who had no children to begin with, would now certainly never be able to have any. But Rihanna said there was no way she would ever have a child with George. In retrospect, she realized how lucky she was to have never conceived his child. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was having a hard time and was on the verge of a breakdown. The girl couldn't believe any of this was really happening, and she was disgusted by the whole mess. The thought that she had been dating such a pathetic, despicable scumbag for so long gave her no peace. Liz fell very ill, and the maids had to call a doctor, who told the lady she needed to rest and recover. He also said that Earl Royden had ordered him to keep it a secret last time, but now he had to report that Elizabeth had recently ingested a large amount of a harmful substance. The girl immediately jumped out of bed, and the doctor explained that it was the same thing that had poisoned her mistress. He asked if she remembered drinking anything before she fainted. Then the girl stood up on the bed and took a bottle of pills from her dressing table. The doctor gave a nervous laugh and said that although he was forced to obey the Earl's orders, this whole situation deeply concerned him, especially because that medicine was fatal to a fetus. Elizabeth was stunned. She didn't understand what the doctor was talking about. Then, the doctor dropped a bombshell. She had been pregnant for some time. A while later, George also woke up, his entire face wrapped in bandages and tape. They told him his life had been hanging by a thread for the past few days. When the Earl heard that his wife Rihanna was at work, he broke down, shouting about how she could just leave him alone like this. He immediately sat up in bed and demanded his clothes, saying he wouldn't stay here. George yelled that work was his life, that he couldn't lose his position at the Treasury, and that he would prove it to everyone. Soon, Margaret told Rihanna that the Earl had gone to work looking like that. At the Treasury, it seemed no one was happy to see him either, and his colleagues thought he should face some serious consequences. Rihanna smiled smugly. Everything was going according to plan. Meanwhile, George appeared at the Treasury with one arm and one leg broken, barely limping on a crutch. His colleagues were stunned. They couldn't figure out why the Earl was here, as he was supposed to be on sick leave. Then, Perkins told him that if he was here to hand in his resignation, he could have just mailed it. But George just replied coldly that he had done nothing wrong enough to get him fired. The whole thing was his private life as a citizen. He hadn't done anything too out of line, and he intended to continue working here. But Perkins just sneered and said he was firing him anyway because he had dragged the reputation of all Lestrade officials through the mud, and he had to resign immediately. However, George had no intention of doing so, saying that Duke MacDonald had vouched for him, so he could keep his position. Perkins walked past him and said that in that case, he could keep his position until the end of the workday. When George walked towards his work area, he found that his desk was gone. His colleague told him that the desk had been moved a few days ago on the Marchioness's orders. Just then, a staff member rushed into the hall, saying they had posted something interesting in the foyer. Meanwhile, Elizabeth told the doctor her child was dead. The doctor was shocked and asked her how many pills she had taken to cause such a result. He was worried she had intentionally aborted the child, and Liz admitted it, saying she had no intention of carrying that bastard child. She was going to be a top figure in Lestrade and would never raise some little monster. Just then, a maid rushed into the room, saying they had posted a notice for everyone to read. The notice was written by a servant who had worked at the Royden estate for over 10 years, and it said that George was a degenerate man who lived off others while also fooling around with his own sister-in-law for years. All the servants at the estate knew about it, but they were afraid of being punished, so they all kept quiet. At the bottom of the notice, there was also evidence to support the servants' claims. Before George could finish reading, the guards called out to him. They arrested him on suspicion of corruption and intentional injury, and he was soon sent to prison to await trial. George kept trying to explain, saying it was all just a huge misunderstanding. But the investigator told him that Duke MacDonald had confessed to everything, so both of them would soon be stripped of their positions and exiled. Furthermore, there were witnesses who confirmed the Earl's attempted murder. A Viscountess named Benegons testified that she had served Royden for a long time, and then one morning, bang, she was kicked out with no letter of recommendation, nothing. What's worse, the Earl was afraid she would leak his secrets and try to poison her. That's when she decided, if I put up with this crap any longer, I'm dead. So Earl Royden had to pay. He put his loyal servant in danger just so he could fool around as he pleased. Then, George tried to tell the investigator that Elizabeth was the one to blame, that she had planned to drive away and get rid of those servants. Then the investigator asked if the Earl admitted to poisoning his wife, Rihanna Royden, at which point George shut his mouth. Meanwhile, the families of the noblewomen who had received his letters also filed charges. Based on all this, "We are launching an investigation." Back at the residence, a maid told Elizabeth that the Earl had been arrested and that the investigation had cleared her of suspicion. The maid said that Earl Norton had demanded they protect Elizabeth at all costs. But Elizabeth said it was all over. Her father could keep her out of prison, but he could do nothing about the fact that she had betrayed the Emperor. They were piling up accusations against Elizabeth: infidelity, attempted murder, and most importantly, she would be an empress who was pregnant by another man. Meanwhile, the truth about Earl Royden's affair spread like wildfire throughout the empire. Before long, Rihanna and Elizabeth had a little meeting. The Countess slapped her sister across the face and asked her how it felt to sleep with her husband. Elizabeth just burst out laughing, saying Rihanna seemed angry that her man had been stolen. But Rihanna knew it was only because George was her husband. Elizabeth seemed to think that stealing her sister's man was her way of winning, but that would never work. If she could handle her own insecurities, maybe one day she could actually win and become Empress. Elizabeth trembled with anger and fear, but she didn't dare say a word. Then Rihanna ordered her sister's things to be moved into the hallway, because Elizabeth was returning to their northern residence. Thanks to their father, at least the girl wouldn't have to rot in a dungeon with George. The man had taken care of his daughter, which was the only reason Rihanna was letting her live. A little while later, George learned he had a visitor. It was Rihanna. As soon as he saw her, he grinned like a fool and rushed towards his wife. He knew she wouldn't believe the rumors and would come save him. But just then, the man standing next to the Countess handed George a piece of paper. It was Rihanna's lawyer. George was thrilled that his wife had hired a lawyer to help clear his name, but his smile vanished the moment he was told the document in his hand was a divorce agreement. The Earl immediately broke down, begging his wife not to do this to him, saying he would die if she left him. He said he was even willing to get on his knees if she would just show some mercy. Rihanna just smiled at this, as if she couldn't care less about her husband's pleas. She was only here to see his face one last time before he died, and the girl was very pleased that her husband looked so pathetic. The thought that if she ever thought of her husband in the future, she would surely remember him looking like this cheered her up. A while later, Rihanna went to the imperial palace, and the emperor was happy to see her after so long. She told him the divorce proceedings will be finalized soon. The emperor then asked if they should also arrest Elizabeth, or at least cut her off from society forever. But Rihanna replied, sounding sad, that as long as her father was alive, she wouldn't touch her. Because of the whole Empress situation, there wasn't much that could be done, so she had sped up the process. But she was worried her frail father might not be able to withstand such a blow. At this, Alexander said that if anything happened, he could send the royal physician over. He added that if she wished, she could strip her sister of her power at any time, or even, get rid of her. The emperor would never consider having a future heir with someone like that. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was hiding in her room at her father's estate, trying to figure out what on earth she should do. A white-haired man suddenly entered and told her she needed to eat something, or her health would be ruined. Alone again, she took out a small vial of liquid. Liz thought that if she lost the child too, she could never become empress. She wouldn't be able to marry, or even show her face in high society at all. So, wouldn't it be better to have this child in Estrade? Even an illegitimate child could gain inheritance rights, and thanks to Joseph Royden, she could seize the Royden family's inheritance. Elizabeth knew that if her father died, Rihanna wouldn't leave her a single penny. So her only way to survive was to have the child and then fight for the Royden family's fortune. She walked to the mirror and stared intently at her reflection in her belly. She told her child that they would have to fight for their lives the next day. Rihanna ordered the servants to pack her things, just as Joseph walked in. The Countess said she was leaving the mansion, as she no longer had any family ties to the Royden family. She planned to stay at the Norton Hotel. Then, the young man announced that his proposal of remarriage was still valid. However, Rihanna had no intention of staying and instead wished Joseph a happy marriage with his future wife. Finally, she said that even though George was in prison, he still held his title, and as long as he was alive, this house belonged to him. Meanwhile, the imprisoned Earl received a visit from his coachman, James. He said that he and the other servants were trying to get their master out. George was overjoyed, thinking he was finally getting out of prison, and then James handed him a flask. He said he had brought the Earl his favorite whiskey to make the whole situation a little more bearable. Then George apologized for accusing the coachman that night, but the young man said he had already forgotten about it. After the Earl finished the whiskey in the flask, James handed him a piece of paper. Unfolding it, George realized it was a will that the coachman had written in his name, stating that George would be leaving this world and passing his estate and title to his younger brother, Joseph. But before the Earl could protest, his body suddenly went limp and blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. James took the flask from his hand and said that he had kept the Earl's dirty secrets and had always been loyal, only to be betrayed in the end. The coachman cursed his former master as a scumbag, then turned and left, leaving the man to die alone. When James returned to the mansion, Joseph handed him a whole bag of gold coins as a reward for his excellent work. Now he could rightfully be called Earl Royden. Standing behind him, Rihanna asked unhappily what he had done. Then Joseph repeated her words, saying that as long as his brother was alive, this house was not his property. And now he hoped that they, Rihanna and he, could look after this place together. But the girl again advised him to find a good wife and then turned towards the exit. Joseph realized he couldn't win the Countess's heart, so he wished her happiness, saying she absolutely deserved it. Rihanna just gave a cold laugh and said she was long past the stage where she could be happy. For her, all that was left was to strive to become even more unhappy. As night fell, Elizabeth was asleep in her bed at her father's house. In the middle of the night, she was woken up, supposedly for something important. When the girl stepped out of her room, her father was already waiting for her. He hesitated for a moment, then announced that the Emperor had proposed to Rihanna. He was going to marry her as his Empress, the man commented, saying it was all very unexpected, even for him. Elizabeth immediately shouted in anger, saying the Emperor didn't really love her and just wanted to marry into the Norden family. She didn't understand. Did her father possess some kind of secret wealth? However, the man quickly reassured her, saying he didn't know the reason for all this himself. Before the girl left, he hastily added that Elizabeth would be made queen. He also said that he needed to meet with the Emperor at least once. Before sending a reply, Elizabeth immediately ran to her father. The last thing she wanted was for him to refuse the ruler. The man hesitated, as his daughter's reputation wasn't exactly clean, but Liz insisted it didn't matter, because he would still marry her. Just then, a servant interrupted their conversation to announce that Miss Rihanna had arrived at the residence. Her father went to greet his eldest daughter, while Liz rushed back to her room, rummaging through her things. She thought to herself that she never expected things to turn out this way. But she wasn't going to just accept reality. Maybe she couldn't be the Empress, but at least she could be the queen. The girl recalled her sister's words, that she couldn't win just by stealing men. But picking up a small vial of poison, Elizabeth thought that maybe she could still defeat Rihanna. The next second, she drank the liquid from the vial. Then, blood gushed from her mouth, and she collapsed on the floor. The girl woke up in a bed. Her sister Rihanna was sitting by her bedside and told her the child was gone. Elizabeth just smiled, almost gloating, and asked if her sister was planning to tell the Emperor everything. It didn't matter if Liz was unfaithful, because His Majesty would still marry her as queen. It could be said that certain things were not a decisive obstacle to obtaining that title. Then Rihanna asked if her sister knew why the Emperor was doing this, but she didn't care. Rihanna said the Emperor had revealed a prophecy from an oracle, and that was the reason they were being taken as wives. Elizabeth was surprised and asked what the oracle had prophesied. Then, the Countess revealed that the next emperor would undoubtedly be born of a woman from a northern family. The younger of the twins couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never even considered such a possibility. Rihanna said that from the beginning, it didn't matter which sister was married. The key was that the Countess was married at the time, but as soon as she got divorced, she also received a proposal. Elizabeth began to gradually understand the situation. If she hadn't touched George, the position of Empress would have been hers from the start. Considering Rihanna and George couldn't have children, which was why they always drew critical gazes, her sister was destined for nothing but an unhappy married life. However, thanks to someone's contribution, everything changed. His Majesty promised Rihanna that he would not have children with Elizabeth. Soon, the medicine that would make Elizabeth infertile would start to take effect. Therefore, this was Liza's first and last child, and her only chance to become the mother of the next emperor. The girl seemed numb, not believing her sister's words, as if despair was spreading through her entire body. Then Rihanna thanked her, because thanks to her, she would become the Empress and bring a ruler to the nation. And she was willing to endure her sister's presence just to enjoy her miserable expression. At that moment, Elizabeth couldn't take it anymore. She lunged at her sister and grabbed her by the throat. She screamed that she wouldn't let it go, that she would definitely kill Rihanna. Just then, the girl's father ran into the room. He grabbed Elizabeth, pulled her away from her sister, and told her to calm down. The girl yelled that this thing had stolen her place, and then her father slapped her hard across the face. He declared her behavior was outrageous, that she was the only one to blame, and that even if she begged on her knees, it wouldn't make up for her mistakes. Then Rihanna announced she was taking her leave, and her father wished her a safe journey. After the girl left the room, Elizabeth glared at her father with a crazed look in her eyes, saying he had hit the future queen and he would suffer the consequences. The man yelled back at his daughter's audacity, saying he was going to send the letter of refusal to the emperor right now. Liz threatened him, saying he had no right to go against the oracle's prophecy. Then her father said he wasn't going against it, because Elizabeth was not a Norton. An interesting thing happened 23 years ago. A friend of Rihanna's father, Gordon, went to prison. They called him a traitor. The young man's name was Howard, and he said he had been framed. He told Gordon not to worry about him, as his days were numbered anyway, but he had a daughter. As soon as he was locked up, his wife gave birth prematurely. He only asked Gordon to give his child a decent life, because if things continued as they were, the girl would live a miserable life of servitude. He begged Gordon to adopt his daughter as his own. Gordon himself was about to have a daughter, and he could say the two girls were twins. Howard made his final request: adopt his daughter, Lisbeth, and raise her as Lisbeth Norton. After saying this, he died. So Liz is not a real Norton. This meant she had no right to marry the emperor. After a pause, Lisbeth asked her father if anyone else knew about this. When Rihanna returned to the residence, a magnificent outfit and jewelry were waiting for her, a gift from the emperor for tonight's celebration. She hesitated, feeling a bit embarrassed to accept such a valuable gift, but the maid said the emperor insisted she take it. They announced a celebration at the palace to introduce the future empress. Since Rihanna was temporarily staying at the Norton estate, preparing for her wasn't easy, so the emperor ordered a gift to be sent. Soon, the celebration arrived, and she appeared in the gown gifted by Alexander, and all the guests were stunned by the future empress's beauty. Elizabeth was also at the party, and she commented that her sister had perfectly stepped into her new role, second to none. With a fake smile, she said she was very happy to continue living with the future empress. Seeing her sister's cold face, Liz said she loved her no matter what, even if Rihanna hated her. But just then, everyone suddenly fell silent. The emperor himself appeared in the hall, dressed in a magnificent white suit. Rihanna and Elizabeth immediately curtsied to the ruler. But Alexander didn't even acknowledge Liz and walked straight to her sister. He took her hand and invited her for the first dance, and she smiled and gladly agreed. Elizabeth was left alone, watching with jealousy as the emperor led her sister away. As the partners twirled on the dance floor, Rihanna thanked the emperor for such a wonderful gift. Then, Alexander asked about the health of the future empress's father. The girl replied that he was feeling a bit unwell, but his condition would improve with both of his daughters becoming members of the royal family. So the queen couldn't be touched for now, and Earl Norton's weakening health was a cause for concern for Rihanna, and it also caught the attention of the emperor himself. The girl was surprised that the ruler would care about such things, but he said she was going to be his wife, so of course he would consider them. Rihanna pointed out that she wouldn't be His Majesty's only wife, but to Alexander, she was the only wife he cared about. After all, everyone knew the saying, take two as wives, but love one as true. But the emperor suggested keeping matters of the heart secret for now. Meanwhile, the music ended, and then Alexander invited Rihanna to dance again. Just then, Elizabeth walked up to them, apologizing for her impertinence, but decided to ask the emperor for a dance. The emperor said he had to refuse, as he had already promised someone else. But Elizabeth didn't give up, saying she wanted to ask Alexander something. She asked if he knew that her sister had been unable to conceive for 4 years. Rihanna immediately lowered her head, and the emperor grimly asked Elizabeth what exactly she was trying to say. The girl explained it was just curiosity, because if her sister couldn't produce an heir, then the ruler would have to, Rihanna froze, understanding the problem, but not knowing what to say. She had made a deal with the emperor that she would bear him an heir, and in return, his majesty would not consider Elizabeth as a candidate to be the mother of the prince. However, there is still a chance that Rihanna might not be able to conceive at all. A messenger suddenly appeared in the hall, interrupting her thoughts, saying he had an urgent message for Lady Rihanna. Some kid just told me that Count Norden kicked the bucket. The girl couldn't believe her ears, while her sister stood by, smiling smugly, as if she knew something. Seeing the smile on Elizabeth's face, Rihanna immediately understood that she had killed their father. Then she felt the world spin, and then she fainted. The emperor caught her just in time, trying to wake her up. Elizabeth also pretended to help, rushing over. But when Rihanna woke up, Liz dropped a bombshell, saying that the thing she'd been drinking would be a big problem if she were pregnant. She asked her, "Do you think someone who has been taking it for a year straight can still get pregnant?" After some time, Gordon's funeral finally arrived. Rihanna's father officially had died of a heart attack, with no one reaching him in time. But Rihanna didn't believe this story. Her father had never had heart problems, and with so many servants in the manor, it seemed no one knew anything for sure. But she suddenly remembered that all the servants had been busy dressing Lisbeth that day, so only her father and Liz were in the mansion. She remembered her sister's smirk at the banquet, so she had known it all along. Rihanna couldn't believe Liz would actually do something like that. Just then, Margaret came over and told her she had saved a spot for her so she could say her final goodbyes to her father. Standing before Gordon's coffin, Rihanna said that according to the doctor, he had died of a heart attack, and the autopsy showed no signs of foul play. But why couldn't she shake the feeling that something was wrong? It was because Rihanna thought she had basically let Elizabeth kill their father. But if she really did it, she wouldn't get away with it. Rihanna would personally destroy everything she held dear. After the farewell ceremony, she said they needed to find out what exactly their father was doing on the day he died. She sent Margaret to investigate everyone in the manor, including those who had visited even once in the past month. They also needed to find out what Elizabeth was doing that day and who was the last to see her, as it was clear they were still missing something. After some time, the day of Rihanna and the emperor's wedding arrived, and the maids were busy decorating the palace for the grand ceremony. Margaret personally helped her mistress, pondering the best way to get revenge on Elizabeth, and concluded that it would be the greatest torture for her if Rihanna and the emperor could be truly happy. This way, Rihanna could both get revenge on her sister and find happiness for herself. But the girl herself was tormented by a question. Could she ever experience love again after George's betrayal? She understood that love couldn't protect her. She didn't know how Alexander felt, and besides, they were bound by a contract. There could be no love in such a relationship. These thoughts caused Rihanna great pain. However, her preparations were complete, and it was time to head to the ceremony. The bride appeared in a stunning wedding dress with a massive train that Margaret had to help carry. Alexander was already waiting at the altar, thinking his bride had never looked more beautiful. As Rihanna walked towards him, they both glanced back at where Lisbeth was standing. The girl was wearing a simple dress and, frankly, looked rather awkward next to her sister. But the newlyweds didn't care about Liz's feelings. The emperor took Rihanna's hand, called her his Empress, and invited her to enter the hall. Elizabeth was filled with hatred for what was happening before her eyes, feeling like a complete third wheel. Following that, Rihanna and Alexander walked into the ceremonial hall, where the guests erupted in a warm welcome for their future empress. Meanwhile, Liz just followed behind them alone, with not a single guest bothering to greet her. Soon, the wedding ceremony began. The priest recited the prayers, asking if the emperor was prepared to love and cherish the Norden sisters through thick and thin, fulfilling his duties as a husband. Alexander answered without hesitation. When it was Rihanna's turn to take her vows, her face stiffened, but she still said she agreed. Later, after the ceremony, she asked her husband to forget the vow she had made that day. She said she couldn't love him. Alexander comforted her, saying he felt the same way, though he hadn't expected Rihanna to come to him on her own. The girl replied that it was their agreement. She was obligated to fulfill it. The emperor then said he was glad she hadn't changed her mind. After all, the next moment, he kissed her, holding her tightly. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sat alone in her chambers as her maids reported that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived at the Empress's palace. Realizing she had been slighted again, the girl was consumed by rage. However, she forced a smile and told her maids they could rest. When Liz was alone, she mused that she had known from the beginning Rihanna would be the Emperor's first choice. Liz's situation was clearly much better than before, but she still felt terrible. She had come too far to turn back. Still, in the end, she would be the one Alexander Steerage chose. So she would let Rihanna have her laugh, because it wouldn't last long. Meanwhile, Rihanna herself was in bed with her husband. Although she didn't resist, she was visibly trembling, and the Emperor noticed. He told her to just get some sleep for the night, and that he would understand if she didn't want to be intimate. Rihanna realized he had sensed her fear. When they kissed, she felt her blood run cold, just like the day she first saw George and Elizabeth together. That horrible feeling, a mix of chill and nausea, seemed tied to the memory of that day. It was pure disgust. When His Majesty stopped, Rihanna felt a sense of calm for some reason. But this wouldn't do. It was her duty, after all. Just then, Alexander told her not to force herself, but she said they might not have much time. The man was completely baffled, so she explained that the substance she had been taking might affect her fertility. The Emperor asked, "Why are you only telling me this now?" Rihanna said she needed time because things were still uncertain. She also dropped the bombshell that she suspected the Queen of murdering her father. The problem was she didn't have any concrete evidence yet. But at the banquet, she had smiled, and she had even told Rihanna about the, situation. Still, they couldn't be sure if she would really have problems. More importantly, the Queen was also taking the same thing, but she hadn't shown any changes yet. So Rihanna asked her husband to be patient, because if Elizabeth was also taking the same thing, they could monitor her. The Emperor was very annoyed that Rihanna was always tied to the Queen, tying his hands. They couldn't wait any longer. At this, the girl assured him that she would definitely find some evidence. The next day at tea, the girls were gossiping, saying the Emperor seemed to have fallen for his Empress at first sight. Listening to all this, Rihanna forced a smile so no one would get suspicious, but she knew love was far from the truth. Last night, Alexander had told her that he didn't want to be loved, nor did he want to love anyone. Those feelings were too fleeting and would only leave resentment in the end, even if the feelings were insignificant at the start. So he suggested to Rihanna that they not fall in love and just help each other, like when they first met. But to the guests, the girls said His Majesty was taking such good care of her that she could only be grateful. Then the girls asked if the Queen had left the castle. They thought she was just too ashamed to show her face, especially since the Emperor wasn't interested in her at all. Just then, Elizabeth sauntered over to the table and gave a slight curtsy to her sister, the shining star of the Empire. Rihanna retorted sharply that she hadn't invited the Queen here. Liz pretended to be hurt, replying that the Empress's words were hurtful, but then she grinned and added that they both fit the prophecy. This was just perfect. Liz placed a basket of cookies on the table, saying she had baked them for His Majesty herself, as she had been a master in the kitchen since she was a child. Rihanna said that was a long time ago, and she barely remembered, but Liz acted as if it were yesterday. Then the girl leaned in close to the Empress and asked if she might have caught it too. Rihanna asked, and the girl just said she was joking. She sat down at the table, saying she was just upset about not being invited to the tea party. Seeing their confused expressions, she asked if her joke had really fallen that flat. Then the Queen offered the cookies, saying they didn't look like much, but they tasted pretty good. All the ladies immediately became awkward, making excuses like a sore throat, trying to avoid tasting the Queen's treats. So Elizabeth said that in that case, she would just eat them all herself and took a bite of a cookie. The guests exchanged nervous glances, not believing the Queen would actually taste her own food. Liz smiled and asked the Empress to invite her for tea sometimes, as she had no one but her sister, and their father would have wanted to see them together. Rihanna's face immediately darkened. Elizabeth was acting as if she hadn't, taken care of that person. The guest commented that the Empress clearly hadn't recovered from the grief of the Count's unexpected death. Then one of the ladies said that Count Norden could rest in peace, as both his daughters had achieved such high status. Rihanna thanked the lady for her kind words, but Liz interrupted their conversation. She said she had received the Emperor's proposal first, but a vicious rumor had cost her the title of Empress. It was a heavy blow to her father as well, as the rumor spread like wildfire, almost as if someone was intentionally fanning the flames. But Elizabeth hoped it wouldn't cause trouble for anyone else. Only a fool, Rihanna thought, wouldn't understand what Elizabeth was implying. The right to be Empress was originally hers, but they took it away and made her queen. No one knew if the Queen was really that bad, or if someone had fabricated the rumors. If so, did the Empress really deserve her position? If you mix truth and lies just right, people's doubts will continue to grow. Elizabeth had really used her head this time. Then Liz smiled and added that even with these injustices, it was a great honor for her to be by Her Majesty the Empress's side. Rihanna replied that if she was truly so grateful, she should be more careful with her words in the future, as they sounded like she was questioning His Majesty's wise decision. The Emperor probably knew what was going on, because he was the one who put Elizabeth in her place in the end. Rihanna said she should be grateful to the Queen for the prophecy and hoped she would remember that while living in the palace. Meanwhile, Alexander went to the temple, but they told him there were no new prophecies. There hadn't been one for over 30 years. The previous emperor had only received one prophecy in his entire life, so Alexander shouldn't expect much. The emperor thought that if both the empress and the queen were poisoned and unable to conceive, he probably wouldn't get a new prophecy. That's how things had developed, and with the deadline approaching, the next emperor had to come from the Northern family. Still, he was troubled by the question of which sister was supposed to bear him, but it seemed Alexander had no choice. The advisor noticed the emperor was always frowning, so the man explained that the empress had told him about the poison not long ago, and it was unknown if the queen was involved in Count Norton's murder. The advisor couldn't believe Elizabeth was capable of something so terrible. Then Alexander said that nothing was certain yet, but they needed to be prepared. He told the man to secretly find a healer to create an antidote, and that Duke Colleen must not find out. The red-haired man said he would carry out his master's orders. The emperor was lost in thought, realizing he was dealing with poison again, just like his parents' history repeating itself. His mother, Empress Liliana, a woman of humble origins, had won her position through his father's relentless pursuit. But his father, the former Emperor Richard, was too fickle to be faithful to one woman and began cheating just 3 years into their marriage. Abandoned by the man she loved, Alexander's mother fell ill from a broken heart. In the Empress's palace, the only person who genuinely cared for her was her handmaiden. Liliana treated her like a sister and relied on her completely. That lonely handmaiden in the palace, who sought only power, Liliana never even suspected she was having an affair with her own husband. In the end, the people she trusted most, the emperor and that handmaiden, poisoned her to death. That woman's name was Rosalind Killen. She was Albert's biological mother and the only daughter of Duke Killen. Alexander thought how ironic it all was. He had sworn never to be like his father, but it had ended up this way after all. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him. Who could it be? He wondered. He had ordered all the servants to leave the garden. Just then, a girl approached him, saying she had been looking for the emperor for a long time. It was Elizabeth. The man immediately asked what she was doing here. The queen then said she was also chosen by the oracle, so she had the right to spend at least one night with His Majesty. Alexander asked how she dared to show up at the emperor's palace uninvited, dressed like that. The girl said love makes people do crazy things and pleaded with him to consider her feelings. But the emperor just told her to be rational, because in any case, such tricks didn't prove any feeling she had for him, and she shouldn't have just barged in. Elizabeth yelled that she was his wife too, the queen of the empire, and didn't she have the right to see her own husband? Alexander just replied coldly that he had not given the queen that right, and if she wanted to be treated as such, she should behave accordingly. Elizabeth yelled that one day the emperor would regret this and beg for her to come to the palace. He would need her to bear the future heir. Eventually, he would come crawling back, begging for her love. But Alexander just scoffed. He said love was just a daydream, and then left her. But Elizabeth wasn't going to give up. She would make him beg her. But first, she had to deal with Rihanna. That morning, the Empress learned of the Queen's little conflict with her husband. The Empress's head housekeeper, Elizabeth, said it seemed the guards patrolling the gate hadn't noticed Elizabeth. The Emperor was surprised, but he was very calm when he left. The Queen was definitely up to something. Elizabeth also mentioned that the Queen had baked cookies that morning and brought them to the Emperor, but His Majesty didn't even accept her gift. Then Rihanna said they should prepare some wine as a birthday gift for His Majesty. It was the first celebration after their wedding, so it had to be something rare and expensive. However, the housekeeper said that might not be a good idea. It turned out the Emperor wasn't known for being a wine lover. Not many people knew this, but Alexander only drank a little white wine, and even so, it wouldn't be a good gift. So Elizabeth suggested making him an apple pie. Apparently, Empress Liliana used to bake it for him when he was a child. Rihanna thought it was a brilliant idea and announced she would bake the pie herself. They sent for Alan, the palace's head pastry chef, to help her. Rihanna had heard he was an absolute expert. Alan even mentioned that he had cooked for the Empress herself. She then admitted she had never really cooked before, but the man assured her it wouldn't be too difficult. But as soon as he turned his back, the stove she was at caught fire. All her culinary efforts went up in smoke again. But Alan didn't lose hope. He knew his mistress could succeed. The problem was that Rihanna had burned herself, so we have to treat that wound first. Just then, Margaret rushed into the kitchen, saying there was an emergency. So Rihanna asked if everyone had abandoned their posts. After the girls left the kitchen, Margaret said they still hadn't found any evidence or witnesses. It was said that the Count and Elizabeth hadn't argued at all, and they were both smiling during dinner before he kicked the bucket. Still, there was something fishy about the whole thing. The cook who was supposed to be on duty that day had received a letter of recommendation the night before and then took off. She disappeared before anyone could question her. And guess what? The letter of recommendation had Rihanna's signature on it. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was impressed with how quickly her handmaiden had dealt with the cook. It was a rather tricky situation, and she was glad the girl had handled it. Still, she worried if she had truly erased all traces. The girl said she had hidden her well, and no one would be able to find her. It was easier than she thought, because she had no family or friends. Even if someone did find something, the handmaiden promised to take care of everything. The only thing her lady needed to worry about was reaching the top. Elizabeth was surprised by her unusual way of doing things. Usually, people like this girl had ulterior motives, so she asked the handmaiden if she could trust her. The girl replied that she would prove her loyalty to the queen with her entire being. After all, her life depended on Elizabeth. If the trail led back to them, she would be finished. But if the queen came to power, she could become the head handmaiden of the palace. Elizabeth noticed she was a lot like this girl. Her parents were deep in gambling debt, and she had left before they could sell her younger sister. The way she craved money and tried to climb the ladder showed she was no ordinary girl. But Liz didn't know if she could trust her now. The Emperor supported Rihanna in everything, and she needed a loyal person too. Elizabeth had no power in the palace, so a few more helpers would really change things. But Rihanna controlled all the handmaidens from the Northern Estate, so she had to be careful now. For now, Liz could only trust the servants from her own palace who hadn't dealt with her yet. A girl who craved money and recognition wouldn't betray her easily, so she felt she could use Diana. The queen gave the handmaiden a large bag of cash, enough to cover living expenses and then some. Diana thanked her mistress and promised to prove her loyalty. Then Elizabeth told her that from now on, she would be her eyes and ears. Meanwhile, Margaret treated Rihanna's wound, which turned out to be more serious than they thought. But the Empress refused to see a doctor more focused on her private plans. They had to find the missing handmaiden before Elizabeth got to her first. Margaret promised to find her as soon as possible. Rihanna then asked the girl to help out at the dinner party, where they would be meeting Prince Albert for the first time. The Empress was nervous to death, worried something would go wrong. When the meeting finally began, the girl, just as she had expected, had trouble eating because of the wound on her finger. Then the Emperor held up food on his fork to Rihanna's mouth, telling her to eat. The girl panicked, saying she could call a servant, but the Emperor refused. He saw that Rihanna couldn't even hold her fork properly, so he said bluntly that he would feed her himself. The girl hesitated, saying the prince and queen were right there. But this was all part of Alexander's plan. He was deliberately putting on this show in front of them. Then Rihanna smiled and said she wasn't about to refuse such a tempting offer. After carefully tasting the food from her husband's fork, the girl turned to Prince Albert and said his older brother was very considerate. The young man said that everyone in high society had heard about their close relationship. Rihanna pointed out that it was all thanks to His Majesty's care. He was always by her side, so adapting to palace life wasn't so difficult. The girl then asked Elizabeth for her thoughts, and she stammered her agreement with the Empress. Albert asked Rihanna to take care of his brother, as he had always wanted Alexander to have a good family. He said he hoped to hear news of the child of prophecy soon, but the Emperor cut him off. The man said his younger brother was being particularly talkative today. He told him to watch his words in the future and not to start empty conversations that could cause misunderstandings. Then Elizabeth asked if the Emperor would like to spend the night at the Queen's palace, as they had brought some good wine today. But Alexander just took Rihanna's hand and said he would be spending the night with the Empress. Liz immediately shut her mouth when she saw the look of pure hatred directed at her sister. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to an unknown palace, where a middle-aged duke is sitting at his desk when there's a knock on the door. A girl entered the study and reported that the emperor was spending the night at the Empress's palace and wasn't paying any attention to the queen. The man then announced that everything was ready and that it would be best to deal with the queen as well, so she would also fall into the trap. By using the queen's jealousy, they planned to get rid of the Empress, and then the emperor would be alone. The man then asked the stranger if she understood her importance in this whole affair, and she answered affirmatively. The next moment, the girl took off her hood, and it was Diana, the very handmaiden who had sworn loyalty to Elizabeth. But now she was planning to cause big trouble for the queen. Just then, a blue-haired girl woke up in a hospital bed, her face and head wrapped in bandages. She screamed the Empress's name. She didn't understand where she was, and then the man walked in, saying she was at Duke Killian's estate. He said the girl was found in a wrecked carriage and was immediately brought to his mansion, where her wounds were treated. The girl thanked the Duke, but he found it strange that the first thing she did was call for the Empress. Was she her personal servant or something? But the Duke noted that even though she wasn't technically a servant, she still called for the Empress immediately upon waking. So the man just turned and walked out of the room, saying he was mistaken and that this girl had no connection to the Empress. Suddenly, the girl asked him what happened to Her Majesty, but Killian retorted sharply that it was audacious of her to ask about things that didn't concern her. The girl then said she really wanted to know, especially if it involved Her Majesty. At that, the man yelled that he wouldn't tell her anything. The girl quickly tried to calm him down and then mentioned she had been a handmaiden at the Norden estate for 10 years. The man smiled smugly, realizing this little girl had fallen right into his trap. He asked if her name happened to be Emily. Killian explained that during the investigation into Count Norden's death, the Empress had specifically mentioned that name. They found out that a handmaiden named Emily had gone missing. She had left the estate with a forged letter of recommendation, which was all very suspicious. The girl was shocked, so the letter from the Empress was a fake, but she had been sent off in a Norden family carriage. She then asked the man if he knew who had done that to the handmaiden. She introduced herself as Emily, the one from the Norden estate. The girl implied that the person who did it was Her Highness the Queen. The man then confirmed her words. The handmaiden immediately got out of bed, saying she had something to say as well. She then told him what had happened at the Norden estate that day. Duke Killian hadn't expected to hear Count Brown's name again, and even regretted not being able to talk to that girl to the end. But even so, she was a witness, so he already knew the most important thing. The Queen had poisoned the Count's cup. Now it was up to him to decide what to do with this information. Rihanna had a strange dream last night where Elizabeth killed their old father. The girl immediately rushed to the man's side, trying to wake him up. But just then, Elizabeth grabbed her arm, saying she was late again. Rihanna woke up in a cold sweat, screaming her father's name. Alexander, sleeping beside her, immediately knew she was having another nightmare. He said it's hard to get over losing someone you care about, and that honestly, getting close to people is like signing a contract for pain. The girl thanked him for his support, and the man took her hand. He said the antidote would be ready soon, which surprised Rihanna as she had never heard about it. The emperor then explained that the poison in her system would be dissolved, and that he had ordered research to begin to completely cure the girl. Once the antidote was ready, he would consider a treatment to handle the whole fertility issue with the queen, as that would make the Empress feel better. The girl smiled, and Alexander leaned in to kiss her, but just then, the emperor's advisor, Cain, entered their chambers, interrupting the couple's kiss. Seeing that the emperor was awake, he smiled smugly and apologized for his intrusion. The emperor somberly asked what he wanted. It turned out the queen wanted to invite Alexander for a lavish dinner, and she was so insistent on his attendance that Cain was powerless. But the emperor immediately refused, telling him to inform Elizabeth that he had already scheduled a meeting. Cain was about to say that the emperor had no arrangements for the day, but the emperor cut him off, saying he had just made some dinner plans of his own. He intended to spend it with the Empress. The emperor said he didn't want to miss the chance to be alone with her. Soon, the dinner began, and the emperor immediately noticed how delicious the food was. The girl said she had asked Lord Cain what kind of food the emperor liked, but he had told her that he had no particular favorite dish. Alexander explained that even if he did, he wouldn't want anyone to know, because if that information got out, he wouldn't even know who might try to get rid of him. Rihanna then asked if anyone had already tried to poison the emperor, and he said no, but he had some concerns. Seeing the confusion on his wife's face, he said he wasn't worried she would do such a thing, that they were more than just allies. After all, if Alexander didn't trust his wife, he wouldn't have invited her to dinner. Rihanna smiled, and then said it was time for dessert. Just then, Alan entered the dining room and greeted the Emperor and Empress. He served the dessert that Rihanna had made with her own hands, and Alexander realized that was probably when she had cut her hand. But Rhea simply said it was the first time they were celebrating the ruler's birthday, so she wanted to do something special. The girl lifted the lid to show him an apple pie, saying she tried to perfectly recreate the taste he had as a child. Alexander smiled and said that Lady Elizabeth must have told her, as she had once been his nanny. Rihanna then smiled brightly and wished His Majesty a happy birthday. The Emperor thanked her and said he looked forward to seeing her at the birthday ball that night. When the time came, Rihanna appeared at the ball, but she felt she was too formally dressed. But the lady-in-waiting pointed out that the ladies would all be wearing their most splendid gowns tonight, and the Emperor himself would be in formal attire, so his Empress should be as well. Just then, Margaret approached her and said His Majesty had sent her a bouquet of flowers. Rihanna blushed, thinking it was a bit much for just one evening, but still found the Emperor very thoughtful. When the ball finally began, all the guests were excited to get a glimpse of the Emperor's sun and moon. Everyone said the Empress looked stunning and was a perfect match for the man of the hour. Just then, Elizabeth approached the Emperor and congratulated him on his birthday. She said she had prepared a gift for him, a legendary top-vintage wine from Sintis, brewed by Henry Cron himself. Alexander mentioned that his mother used to love that kind of wine, and thanked the Queen for the gift. Elizabeth suggested they have a drink, saying it was a special day. They had a toast to His Majesty's health and good fortune. Rihanna then remembered hearing that the Emperor didn't actually like red wine, but he still agreed to try it. She tried to dissuade him from drinking it, but he didn't seem to be listening at all. Soon, Elizabeth raised her glass and wished for the health of His Majesty the Emperor and for the eternal prosperity of the Esterage Empire. After a slight hesitation, Alexander finally took a sip from his cup. Rihanna watched her husband with concern the whole time. Soon, the Emperor left the ballroom, and Rhea went to find him. She ran into Cain and said the Emperor looked pale, which made her anxious. After a short pause, Cain said His Majesty was outside. The girl then walked towards the door, alerting her husband that she was coming in. The sight she saw shocked her. Alexander was sitting on the ground, leaning against a pillar, with sweat dripping from his face as he breathed heavily. The girl immediately ran to his side, worried about what had happened to him. But he said it was all because of the wine, that he didn't want to show weakness in front of everyone, so he drank it against his will. But now, he asked Rihanna to keep what she saw here a secret. Alexander then leaned against the girl's chest and asked her to just sit with him like that for a while. Rihanna gently stroked her husband's hair and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. After a while, he said he felt much better, all thanks to his wife's efforts, which had really helped him a lot. Now he was determined to show his gratitude to Rihanna. She was about to refuse, but Alexander said he knew she was planning to do some charity work with other nobles. Rhea said she planned to do it right after the celebration, and the Emperor decided to go with her as a show of support. She thanked her husband, saying his presence would be a great encouragement to their cause. He then said they were running late and needed to go back, so the couple returned to the hall hand in hand, and all the while, Elizabeth had been watching them from behind a pillar. She thought to herself that there were two people, but only one prophecy, and she was not happy with how things were turning out. The Queen would decide for herself who would remain by the Emperor's side. The next day, Rihanna arrived at the orphanage, and the staff immediately bowed to her in greeting. The girl hadn't expected such a reverent welcome, as she was there to do good deeds, not to receive honors. The director of the orphanage then said that both the Empress and the Queen, the two sisters, had come today, and their visit itself was a great honor for the orphanage. Rihanna didn't understand what she meant by the Queen, and then the woman pointed to Elizabeth, who had already arrived and had even decided to help them sweep the streets. The girl immediately ran to her sister, saying she was late. But she herself had been eagerly awaiting this day and asked for forgiveness for her impoliteness and early arrival. Rihanna just gave a bitter smile and told her servants it was time to begin. Watching her sister, Elizabeth thought to herself that she was trying to show off in front of the Emperor. Then, out of anger, the girl threw her broom aside, having no intention of continuing the humiliating sweeping. She leaned against a tree, sighing wearily. Just then, a little girl who lived at the orphanage tripped over her feet. The little girl immediately jumped up and, with tears in her eyes, apologized to the Queen, but Elizabeth was furious about the whole thing. She rushed over to the girl and started yelling at her. She berated the child, saying she had ruined her expensive dress. Just then, Rihanna rushed over and asked the girl if she was hurt and why she was crying. The girl pointed at Elizabeth and said her eyes were super scary. The queen interjected, telling her sister not to jump to conclusions based on a child's words. Rhea then told Liz that if she wasn't sincere, she didn't have to come next time, as there was no point in feigning charity. Afterward, the girl took the little girl for afternoon refreshments, while Elizabeth, trembling with rage, had no intention of letting it go. Meanwhile, all the children gathered in the dining hall to taste the snacks the Empress had brought. Elizabeth ran up to her sister and said through gritted teeth that she might have overreacted. She offered to help with the cooking, to which Rhea basically agreed. So the queen headed to the kitchen, where she asked the cook why the potato sprouts were being cut off. The woman explained that they were poisonous and could make people very sick, and that a child had even died from them once. It suddenly occurred to Elizabeth that if the potato toxin could kill, she could get rid of Rihanna and then play dumb. The girl secretly took a few potatoes, thinking that she would soon be the only remaining woman of the prophecy, and His Majesty would then have no choice. The queen then asked the cook to let her handle the potatoes. Just then, Rihanna passed by the kitchen and noticed the women chatting. A short while later, when the dishes were ready, Elizabeth sprinkled ground potato sprouts on Rihanna's plate. Just then, the emperor walked into the orphanage, saying he wanted to see the Empress. While everyone was greeting the ruler, Elizabeth tried to slip away quietly, but the emperor spotted her. He had seen her in the kitchen earlier, when the queen was smiling smugly, as if she knew something. Soon it was time for refreshments, and Rihanna invited her husband to start, but the emperor seemed distracted, as if something was bothering him. Just then, he suggested swapping plates with Rihanna. The girl didn't understand what he meant, as the plates looked identical. He then said that someone might have tampered with her food, and he would feel better if they swapped. The Empress decided not to argue, and soon the emperor began to eat her food, with Elizabeth's eyes fixed on him. After the meal, as they were returning by carriage, Rhea noticed that Alexander's face was paler than usual. She said they could stop the carriage if he wasn't feeling well. The emperor then pointed out that Rhea must have also noticed the strangeness of the queen's behavior. She had given the last portion to her sister and then stared at her with a triumphant smile, and if Alexander hadn't eaten it, Rihanna would have disposed of it herself. The girl suspected something was wrong with the food, but she didn't want to cause a commotion in a place that was already in need of help. But she still couldn't understand why the emperor would make such a sacrifice, as his life was more precious than hers. But he said their lives were equal, and besides, only Rihanna could bear him an heir, as he would not have a child with Elizabeth. The girl then told him that she didn't plan on dying anytime soon. Even so, the emperor said he was still worried about her, and that she shouldn't be so reckless with her own safety. But before he could finish, his lifeless body suddenly collapsed onto his wife, who immediately called for a doctor. Soon, the emperor was taken back to the palace, where the doctor examined him, and everything pointed to poisoning, and a rather large dose at that. Rihanna asked how her husband was doing. The doctor said he had already given the emperor medicine, so the worst was over, but he needed to rest. He then handed the girl a small vial of liquid, an antidote the emperor had asked him to prepare. It wouldn't work immediately. They needed to see his reaction first. Soon, the doctor left the room, leaving Rihanna alone with the emperor. Just then, Elizabeth burst into the room, roaring that only the most despicable person would do such a thing to the ruler. Rihanna didn't understand why her sister was putting on such a show. The queen said she was just there to take care of the emperor, because he was poisoned and Rihanna would have to take his place at the council. But Rhea wasn't buying it, and she ordered her sister to return to her own room, adding that Elizabeth was the prime suspect in the poisoning. The girl shouted that she was the queen and was supposed to bear the emperor an heir, so she wouldn't do such a thing. Rihanna then said that the poisoned soup was meant for her, and it was madness to leave the prime suspect with the emperor. Elizabeth was furious, not understanding why the empress would make such baseless accusations. Rihanna then said that if her sister was so eager to prove her innocence, they would conduct an investigation tomorrow. Elizabeth asked the empress what would happen if she didn't leave. In response, Rihanna slapped her and said that if the queen wanted to keep her pathetic status, she would obey and leave the room quietly. The girl advised her sister not to do anything rash, as she had been lenient with her so far. Elizabeth then threatened the empress, saying she would regret what she had done. With those words, she turned and left the room. Soon, the council meeting began, and Rihanna took the emperor's place, explaining to those present that the ruler had been poisoned the previous night. night. The girl explained that His Majesty had visited the orphanage to support the work of the charity group. He ate nothing but potato soup, and what's more, they had swapped plates before they started eating, so the Empress was the intended target. But the real question was, how was the Emperor poisoned? This meant that everyone at that charity event yesterday was a suspect in an attempt to harm a member of the royal family. Everyone who visited the orphanage yesterday was a suspect, and their movements would be restricted until the investigation was complete. Rihanna also made it clear that there would be no exceptions, not even for the Queen. She then delegated Count Esper to lead the investigation. After Count Esper formed his investigation team, he went straight to the crime scene, the Mason orphanage. The headmistress said she hadn't noticed anything unusual yesterday, or so she thought. However, she did notice something when cleaning the trash can. There were only potato peels inside, but she saw that they had also cut off the sprouts. It seemed the Queen had disposed of the sprouts separately. The Count was surprised. Could the toxin for potato sprouts really be fatal? The director explained that the peels from a whole bag of potatoes would be enough for a lethal dose. Shortly after, the Count reported everything to the Empress. A little later, Lady Proctor, who was involved in the charity work, came to see Rihanna and revealed that Elizabeth had learned about the poison from her. Just then, Rihanna realized there was only one possible culprit, her own sister. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, trying to console herself that so much time had passed that she surely hadn't left any evidence. Perhaps she should have just let it go in the first place. Just then, Diana came in, visibly agitated, as she had just heard some news from the laundresses. Apparently, they had found evidence. The potato peels cut off during cooking were all missing. Lady Proctor went straight to the Empress and accused the Queen of the crime. At that moment, Elizabeth knew she was completely done for. Meanwhile, Rihanna was sitting by the Emperor's bedside. It had been 5 days, and he was still unconscious. She touched her husband's hand, and without realizing it, tears streamed down her cheeks. Just then, the Emperor squeezed her hand back and asked if she was really that worried he would. Rihanna was stunned. After all this time, her husband had finally opened his eyes. But she composed herself and told him they had found the culprit. Count Esper had managed to dig up some inside information, and Lady Proctor had confirmed their suspicions. Alexander then caressed his wife's cheek, praising her for a job well done, saying he knew she could handle anything. He then suggested they finally settle things with the Queen. But Rhea said she hadn't yet found evidence of Elizabeth's involvement in her father's death, but she still wanted her sister to pay for what she had done. Just then, the Emperor advised her to take her time. Just then, Prince Albert came in and greeted his older brother. He said that knowing Alexander was awake, he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Rihanna then stood up, intending to leave the brothers alone, but the Emperor asked her to stay. Albert pointed out that the Emperor didn't look very happy to see him. He said everything was messed up. He was supposed to hate Alexander, and Alexander was supposed to beg for forgiveness. But somehow, Albert had become the only one in the wrong. But the Emperor said that's not how it worked, because hatred was a two-way street, and if he hated his brother, there was nothing to stop his brother from hating him just as much. Albert was surprised by this answer, but Alexander told him to stop acting, because that's how things had always been. The prince then said that if his brother didn't care that he had come to see him out of goodwill, then he would just leave. He had confirmed the Emperor was fine, and now all he could do was wish him a speedy recovery. After the prince left, the Emperor saw the confusion on Rihanna's face and told her to just say what was on her mind. But he explained that this was just how he and his brother were. They hated and despised each other. He then asked his wife if she thought they needed anything else. In response, Rihanna reminded him of what her relationship with Elizabeth was like. Alexander laughed, saying he and the Empress were very similar in that regard. Just then, Margaret burst into the room, breathlessly shouting that they had found the missing lady-in-waiting. The Emperor then congratulated his wife on getting what she wanted much sooner than she had expected. The girl pressed her cheek against the man's palm and said that to celebrate this happy ending, they needed to open another bottle of champagne. Soon, the Emperor's health was fully restored, and he was able to attend the council. He announced that there was only one item of discussion on the agenda today, and that was the crimes of Queen Elizabeth Norton, for which the council must give her the punishment she deserved. deserved. The queen's first crime was the attempted assassination of Empress Rihanna Norden with poison. The plan failed, subsequently endangering the emperor's life, which was the second crime. The third crime was the poisoning of her own father, Count Norden. These accusations were enough to strip the queen of her title. However, at that very moment, a member of the council decided to object. It was Duke Killian, who asked the emperor if there was any evidence pointing to the queen's involvement. Alexander then said that the testimony of Lady Proctor and the investigation by Count Esper should be sufficient. But the duke pointed out that it was no secret that potato sprouts were poisonous, and you couldn't accuse the queen just because some sprouts were missing. The duke then turned to the topic of Elizabeth's father's death, but at that moment, the emperor called someone in. It was Emily, the lady-in-waiting who had been kidnapped. The emperor told her to speak. The girl said that on the day Count Norden was murdered, she was carrying out her duties at the estate. Just then, she saw Miss Elizabeth put something in her father's drink. Almost immediately after that, the count passed away. Emily then stated that was all she knew. The girl looked at Duke Killian, who was smiling smugly and holding a finger to his lips. Emily remembered his words. The man had told her to keep her mouth shut. The emperor then asked the duke if this was sufficient evidence, as they could not let someone live who not only killed her own father, but also dared to threaten the royal family. The other council members had nothing to say, but some were confused, as Elizabeth was the girl from the prophecy. The emperor declared that from this moment on, the queen was stripped of her title and sentenced to death, to be carried out in 3 days. And because of that prophecy, Alexander insisted on carrying out the execution himself. Duke Killian then argued that, considering the same prophecy, executing the queen would be a reckless move, as the empress had not yet borne an heir for the empire. However, the emperor said that he and the empress had only recently married and were both still young, so such concerns were unnecessary. Killian smiled smugly and said he was only thinking of the well-being of the ruling family and the empire, so perhaps they could postpone the sentence for now, as it could be carried out at any time. The emperor glared at the duke, knowing that to others, carrying out the execution now would seem unwise, so he agreed with the man. However, this did not absolve the queen of her crimes. After all, she was the one who served the poisoned dish to the empress. Therefore, the queen's life would be spared, but she would be stripped of her status and assigned as the empress's maidservant. After the emperor finished speaking, there was dead silence in the hall. Because if a girl was of noble birth, she would be granted the title of lady-in-waiting. But if she were a commoner, she could only become a maidservant. In the long history of the Estrage Empire, there was only one case of an emperor's mistress committing suicide. For nobles who valued reputation and honor more than life, they would rather accept poison from the emperor, considering it a dignified death. To lose one's title, become someone else's servant, and endure public scorn was basically another form of death. And this punishment for Elizabeth had been going on for a week. The maids and butlers beat her for every mistake she made. Liz pleaded with Rihanna for help, but all she got was more beatings, as she had no right to address Her Majesty so brazenly. One day, the girl made her tormentors stop. She turned to her sister and said that she had been a servant for days, but still hadn't learned her place. Rihanna then ordered the maids to punish her until Elizabeth stared at her own feet in shame. With that, the empress left the room, while the servants seemed excited that their mistress had finally given them the green light. Elizabeth screamed for Rihanna's mercy, but it was all in vain. Meanwhile, the empress went to see her husband, who asked if she approved of his decision regarding Liz. The girl said she never dreamed the queen would become her servant. She then said she knew Duke Killian had spoken up for Elizabeth, and that, apparently, he wanted to work with her. Rihanna planned to keep a close eye on her sister, while the emperor could decide her fate at any time. However, Alexander hoped this decision would satisfy the empress. For another, more fundamental reason, until now, the queen had never paid for her crimes, which the emperor found infuriating. He wanted her to know what shame felt like. So he was curious what Rihanna really thought of the decision. The girl then said she could only be grateful that the emperor had thought of it. At that very moment, a sharp pain shot through the emperor's head, and Rhea immediately rushed to her husband's side. It seemed he hadn't fully recovered yet, but he refused to see a doctor. Rihanna was upset by this, so she told Alexander to stop being so reckless, as seeing her husband unconscious had hit her much harder than she had imagined. The emperor said he had thought the same thing at the time. The thought of Rhea collapsing after drinking a bowl of soup terrified him. The girl mused that the emperor had therefore drunk the poison for his own sake. But in the end, he was the one in danger, and the Duke had blocked the attempt to punish Elizabeth, most likely because there was no heir. Rihanna decided to tell her husband that the antidote prepared by the doctor had worked. However, the girl asked the emperor to help her every night, implying she wanted to conceive a child. What had happened made her realize that if she didn't give the emperor an heir, this kind of thing would happen again and again. Alexander agreed with her, and the girl then promised to go to the central palace, starting that very night. But the emperor stopped her, saying he would go to the empress's palace instead. Before long, high society was buzzing about the royal family's incredible marital bliss. However, Rihanna had nothing to say about it. The emperor had been visiting her palace after dark for several nights now, but he never took off his own clothes, let alone Rihanna's. Despite this, the girl maintained the rumors about their happy life and future heir. Then a guest asked if the wine served at the founding banquet was really Henri Guinard red wine. Just then, a man came up behind the ladies and said that this banquet would be special, as it was the first founding celebration attended by a female oracle. It was the emperor. He walked up to the girl and said he had missed her so much that he had come uninvited. He suggested that Rihanna join him and enjoy the tea party she had arranged as husband and wife. So the royal couple spent the evening in each other's company. As the tea party drew to a close, the young people said they were very happy to have spent the evening together. The emperor then pulled Rihanna into his arms. He held her tightly, and she blushed deeply. Alexander then said he would see her later that night. He mentioned that the anniversary banquet was approaching, so he had to end the evening's activities early, and with that he left. Rhea gave him a warm smile as he departed, saying goodbye and that she would see him at night. The girl mentioned she was very grateful to the emperor for showing up at the tea party. She also told her husband not to overwork himself preparing for the banquet, as he hadn't fully recovered yet. Alexander chuckled, noting how thoughtful his wife was. Rhea then asked him why he had decided to serve wine at the party since he didn't like it. But the emperor said he would take care of it afterward. An awkward silence hung in the air, and then she wondered if there was a reason he couldn't drink. After a short pause, the emperor revealed that the whole thing stemmed from a murder. He explained that his own father had poisoned his mother. He wanted to make his mistress the empress. One evening, at dinner, the old man poured red wine for everyone. It was the first time in a long while that Liliana had been able to spend time with her husband, so she accepted. That very night, her condition took a sharp turn for the worse, and she passed away in less than a day. Ever since then, the sight of red wine reminded Alexander of her, and he felt like he was walking down the same path. Because there's nothing more painful than being stabbed in the back by someone you trust and love deeply. Rihanna immediately thought of George and Elizabeth. She was all too familiar with this feeling, and what was worse, His Majesty was witnessing it all. Soon after, the royal family welcomed Prince Albert, the son of the very mistress who had taken the title of Queen Consort. It was then that Rihanna realized this might be the reason for his friendly attitude towards her. She said she didn't want to watch him force himself to drink, especially when he was also trying to purge the alcohol from his body. He looked truly miserable at that moment. So Rhea took Alexander's hand and told him she would find another way to help him with his problem. Everyone in the palace had already given up, but she wasn't going to stop there. Then, the emperor asked her why she was trying so hard. Rihanna clenched her fists and replied that they were partners who were supposed to help each other, so she didn't find it strange at all. The next morning, Margaret burst into the couple's bedchambers. The emperor was already awake, but gestured for her not to be too loud. Just then, the handmaiden saw Rihanna sleeping soundly while pillowed on the emperor's arm and hastily exited the room. He leaned closer to his wife, his nose almost touching her cheek, and just then, she opened her eyes. Alex was caught completely off guard and blushed, not expecting Rhea to wake up so quickly. But she simply said that His Majesty was surprisingly handsome so early in the morning. As soon as the words left her mouth, Rihanna immediately fell asleep again, while he just continued to gaze at his sleeping wife. When the Empress finally woke up, she headed to her study. Margaret was already there, surprised because she had seen them wake up together. She told her mistress that the Emperor had been looking at her with an incredibly gentle expression all morning. The handmaiden felt that if things continued this way, the ruler might actually fall in love with her. Rihanna smiled at the girl, but thought to herself, yeah, that's a pipe dream. Meanwhile, the long-awaited anniversary banquet of the empire's founding finally arrived. The emperor and empress were seated at the main table, and he asked her if she had found a solution for his situation. Rihanna said she wasn't sure how effective it would be, but she did prepare something. Then she handed him a specially customized wine glass. If there was poison in the wine, the cup would change color and Alexander would know immediately. Soon, it was time for the emperor's toast, and he called for everyone to raise their glasses for the glory of Estraja. The man brought the cup to his lips, and the color didn't change at all. Seeing this, Rihanna let out a huge sigh of relief, because now her husband no longer had to worry about it. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was carrying out her duties as a handmaiden, and the guests behind her were whispering that it would be better for her to be dead than to live such a shameful life. She heard every word and was furious. How dare these nobodies talk about her like that? Once she reclaimed her title, she would make them pay. They wouldn't break her because she was the rightful empress of this empire. Diana pulled Elizabeth from her thoughts and handed her a letter, saying it was from Duke Killian, Prince Albert's maternal uncle. The handmaiden said he was the only one who voted against deposing Elizabeth. Now, he was promising to help the queen reclaim her position. Elizabeth thought to herself that she must prepare an excellent gift for the Duke. Meanwhile, Rihanna realized that Prince Albert was the only guest at the banquet she hadn't had a chance to greet yet. Alexander wondered what she wanted with him, but she just said she wanted to meet him, as they might not have another chance. Then she asked the emperor if he didn't want her to speak with the prince. Before her husband could answer, she said that she would be his empress until death, and she had no intention of bearing another man's child. The emperor asked if she really thought that was the issue, but the next moment his cheeks flushed, and he said he felt hot and needed some air. The man walked past his wife towards the balcony, trying to cover his cheeks with his hand. Once on the balcony, Rihanna commented that the emperor had drunk a lot and then asked him how he was feeling. The man said he was fine, but he was flattered by her concern. Rihanna mentioned that he had been drinking nonstop because of her, but Alexander cut her off, saying he wasn't forced to drink and that he felt fine now. He smiled and pointed out how considerate she was. After all, she had gone to great lengths to help him with everything he was going through. Then Rhea said that the emperor had done just as much for her. The man panicked, his cheeks flushing again, and he looked away. Rihanna reminded him how he had sent her flowers, accompanied her to the orphanage, and always protected her reputation, so she felt the same way as the emperor. Alexander's cheeks continued to burn, and he couldn't understand why. Had he really drunk that much? Then he asked her if she had ever attended the Foundation Day festival. Rhea replied that she found the streets very interesting when she was a child. So the emperor asked if she wanted to go out for a walk. He said he would love to take a walk with her, just to wander around nearby. The man mentioned he knew a secret passage that only he knew about, so they could slip out without any trouble. Before they knew it, the royal couple had slipped out of the palace and were riding towards the city center. Rihanna said His Majesty's riding skills were so masterful that she almost forgot she was on a horse. Then the man said that if they wanted to keep a low profile, they needed to change how they addressed each other. He told Rihanna it was okay. She could just call him by his name. The girl blushed and shyly whispered her husband's name, Alexander. The man chuckled because she looked as if it was the first time she had ever said his name. But Rhea explained that it was against etiquette to call His Majesty by his given name. Then the emperor told her to just call him Alex, because Alexander was too much of a mouthful. Next, the man took his wife's hand, and she asked where His Majesty was taking her. The emperor smiled and replied that she could just call him Alex and drop the titles. Meanwhile, the city was celebrating, and the couple enjoyed their time alone, so engrossed that they didn't even notice time flying by. Soon, they plopped down on the grass, tasting the local delicacies. One of the desserts happened to fall onto Rihanna's palm. He gently took her wrist and cleaned the spot where the treat had fallen. She was surprised and immediately blushed, but Alex said nothing and just gave her a gentle smile. The next moment, as the fireworks began to bloom, they shared a passionate kiss. They kept kissing until the last firework faded. When it was all over, they pulled back slightly, feeling a sudden wave of awkwardness. So Alexander told her to think of it as practice, since it was Rihanna who had asked him to be with her every night. So far, they had only been holding hands, and the man felt it was time to take things further. The problem was they had been at the party for a long time, so Alex suggested they head back. Rhea gave him her hand, and they started heading back to the palace. The girl thought to herself that even when she found out George was cheating, she hadn't felt like this. Back then, she only felt betrayed, but it wasn't this painful or frustrating. But in the end, she couldn't believe it. Could she really be in love with His Majesty? A stranger bumping into her pulled Rihanna from her thoughts. Alexander immediately pulled his wife to his side, making sure she was okay. The stranger apologized for her clumsiness. She was a middle-aged woman with dark hair. Rihanna found her face familiar. It was Nanny Elizabeth. Before the Empress could say a word, the woman rushed into the crowd and disappeared. The Emperor was completely baffled, but his wife assured him that everything was fine. Then they continued walking towards the palace hand in hand, but Rhea couldn't take her eyes off the woman. A short while later, they returned to the banquet hall. Just then, Lord Kane ran over, out of breath, and said that the nobles were in an uproar over the Empress. Soon, the council was convened. The nobles were confused as to why someone would make accusations against the Empress. She couldn't possibly have deceived the entire empire. Just then, Duke Killian said that Rihanna was likely infertile and, moreover, he was prepared to present evidence. The next moment, a large stack of documents landed on the Emperor's desk. Killian declared that it wasn't difficult to find the evidence, as it was in the private rooms of Count Royden's house. The wine glasses Rihanna drank from had been poisoned over a long period, so enough toxic residue remained to detect the poison. Taking a certain amount of this poison has side effects, including infertility, so the evidence also included a doctor's report. Then Duke Killian asked the Emperor why he seemed so calm under the circumstances. He asked if the ruler knew about all this, and Alexander replied that it was all just speculation. Then Killian said that the empire has only one moon, which might cause problems between the two princes. After all, everyone knew the emperor spent every night with his spouse to no avail. So for the sake of stability and to uphold the empire's traditions, it was worth reinstating the queen consort. Alexander flew into a rage, saying he didn't want to hear any more of it. However, Killian wouldn't back down, saying the emperor should spend the night with the queen consort. Otherwise, the entire empire would find out about the empress's condition. The next day, Alexander appeared in Rihanna's office. The girl already knew the queen consort had been reinstated. The man knew that anything he said would sound like an excuse, but Duke Killian had already hinted at a hidden threat. If he didn't reinstate the queen consort and bring her back to the palace, Killian would leak the secret of the empress's condition. Because of this, the emperor couldn't keep his promise to his wife. Alexander said he had nothing to say about it, then apologized and headed for the door. Rihanna watched him leave, exhausted. But just then, she decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She ran after the emperor and asked if this was his way of protecting her. She said there was no need, because it no longer mattered whether this was a deal or a promise. The problem was, she couldn't protect him anymore either. Then she went up to the emperor and said she had fallen in love with his majesty. Rihanna gently took the man's hand and pleaded with him not to sleep with the queen consort. But as soon as Alexander heard the word love, memories flooded his mind. He remembered his mother crying and screaming at her husband, saying he had once sworn to love her. And the man had just laughed. Just then, a young Alexander had walked into the room to find his mother lying on the floor in tears. Then the emperor told Rihanna that he couldn't return her feelings. He apologized to the girl and left, leaving her alone. Just then, Elizabeth emerged from a corner, saying the empress looked terribly pale. The girl didn't need a formal greeting, as her older sister already knew she wasn't doing well. Elizabeth said that Rhea must have decided to become the emperor's only woman, stripping her of her title. But now the empress didn't have to worry, because the queen consort was about to bear the emperor a child. Then the girl said she was going to prepare for her upcoming night with the ruler, leaving her sister alone. A week had passed since then. It was the night before Alexander and Elizabeth were to spend the night together. Rihanna sat in her study, thinking about how His Majesty hadn't come to see her at all during this time. Suddenly, she noticed that the portrait of her and her husband was crooked again. When she went to straighten the portrait, she noticed something strange behind it. It was a hidden safe with something inside. Rihanna immediately called for Margaret to pry it open and take out what was inside. Inside the hidden compartment was a small box containing several smaller boxes and a book, which Rhea quickly opened. Margaret asked her mistress what she had read that was so shocking. However, the Empress didn't answer. She asked her handmaiden to find someone for her urgently. It was Anna, the cloaked woman who knew Elizabeth's birth mother. Meanwhile, Alexander was walking down the palace corridors, deep in thought. He was troubled by his last meeting with Rihanna, how she had confessed her feelings to him. He had never seen her look at him like that before. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, a completely new feeling he couldn't understand. Just then, the head housekeeper, Elizabeth, came running over. Approaching him, she said Her Majesty the Empress had ordered preparations to leave the palace. The woman didn't know what was happening, but it seemed Rihanna was trying to find someone. She had left a message for the servants, asking everyone to trust her and wait patiently. The head housekeeper asked the emperor if he knew why the empress had left so suddenly, and the man replied that she had confessed her feelings to him. The housekeeper responded that the man seemed to feel the same way, but Alexander himself felt he didn't deserve any of it. Then the woman said that he always looked at Rihanna with such kind and gentle eyes, and his feelings were so obvious that everyone in the palace could see them. Alexander replied that his father had also married his mother for love, but their ending was a painful one. The man believed he had inherited his father's blood, and that it would all end with him bringing Rihanna pain and misery. Then the head housekeeper asked him why he thought Lady Liliana was unhappy. Of course, the late emperor's interest in other women hurt her feelings, but she always said she was happy because Liliana had her son. Alexander, every step he took, every hug he gave made her smile. She said she felt loved, and she hoped her son would experience the same feeling in the future. Alexander couldn't believe that his mother, after all her suffering, still loved him. Tears suddenly streamed down his cheeks. The housekeeper said that love comes in many forms, but Lady Liliana never stopped loving her child, right up to the very end. The man thanked the head housekeeper. He needed to hear that, because the guilt he carried for failing to save his mother was about to crush him. She told him that it wasn't over for him. The Empress felt the same way, and he just needed to stop being afraid of it. The head housekeeper believed that Rihanna would surely understand Alexander. Then the man thanked the woman from the bottom of his heart and gave her a brilliant smile. When the night of the ceremony arrived, Duke Killian congratulated Elizabeth. The girl said that if she could make this happen and provide the emperor with an heir, she would never forget the man's kindness. Then Killian said the queen consort had misunderstood him because she was not the one destined to bear the heir. The emperor would never allow it. He advised Liz to keep doing what she had been doing. Then he took a small box out of his pocket. Inside was a needle, and Elizabeth had to use this poison needle to poison the emperor. The girl immediately screamed, shocked that the Duke would suggest such a thing. Killian just sneered, because for the girl, it would be a very easy task to accomplish. She just needed to get rid of the emperor, and then the Duke would make Lisbeth the Empress of Estradia. He would put Prince Albert on the throne, and the girl would become the one and only star of Estradia. Then Liz thought about how she, not Rihanna, could become the Empress, the noblest woman in the empire. The girl remembered a story Rhea had told her as a child about the cuckoo, a bird that secretly lays its eggs in other birds' nests. The newly hatched cuckoo chick instinctively throws out all the other eggs, a survival instinct. Left alone, the cuckoo chick pretends to be the bird's real chick, living in the nest and eating all the food for itself. Back then, the little girls were very shocked by this fact, but now Elizabeth didn't find it strange at all. She hadn't even known who she really was growing up. Elizabeth always had to fight desperately to achieve anything. So why did Rihanna get everything so easily? She wished she had been Elizabeth Norton from the start, but Rihanna would always be the real daughter. But now, she would represent the Norton family, because she would be the only Elizabeth Norton left. Meanwhile, Rihanna, Margaret, and a team of guards were returning to the palace. Rihanna was holding a stack of documents. She could finally reveal the truth, but she needed to hurry to set things right. Meanwhile, Elizabeth entered the emperor's bedchambers. The man commented that she must be in a good mood since she was finally getting what she wanted. But the girl smiled and said she was just fulfilling her destiny. Since the man had decided to sleep with her, they should get started. As soon as they sat on the bed, Liz asked the emperor to relax. The girl moved closer and hugged him tightly. She immediately pulled a poison needle from her sleeve and aimed it at Alexander's body. Just then, Rihanna burst into the room. The man absolutely did not expect to see the Empress here, but he realized something was wrong and pushed Elizabeth away. Rihanna rushed to her husband and asked if her sister had hurt him, but the man quickly reassured her that the queen consort hadn't managed to harm him, just that the Empress had kept him waiting too long. Then the girl said she was a little late because she was looking for something. At that moment, Elizabeth screamed like a banshee and ran towards them. She and the emperor were about to have a wonderful time, and her sister had interrupted them. Then Rihanna walked up to her and slapped her hard across the face. The girl said Elizabeth's secret could no longer be hidden. The queen consort screamed hysterically, saying she didn't understand what anyone was talking about. Rihanna yelled back at her, saying she had had enough of this whole charade. She ordered her sister to tell the whole truth immediately. Then Elizabeth stood up, a smile plastered on her face, and said she didn't understand what the Empress was implying. Rihanna shot her a deadly glare and said she didn't expect her sister to throw away the last chance she was given. Then she turned to the Emperor and said they needed to go to the council hall immediately and summon all the nobles. Soon, the council was assembled, and Elizabeth was brought in bound. Killian cursed the girl under his breath, as he had been hoping she had already taken care of things. Then, Marquis Pecans, who was also in the council, asked the Empress why they had been summoned, but Duke Pecans cut him off, shouting that it was outrageous to force all the nobles here so late. Rihanna announced with a grim face that they should all be responsible for this emergency summons, as it concerned a matter of utmost urgency. She declared that the matter concerned the queen consort. The girl pointed at Elizabeth and said that she had taken her father's life and had tried to do the same to her. But the list of crimes didn't end there. The queen consort had also deceived the royal family of Estraja. Killian sneered, saying this was all in the past and sounded like some kind of misunderstanding. But Rihanna assured him there was no mistake. First, the criminal concealed the fact that she was not a member of the Norden family. The council members were completely bewildered. If not a Norden, who could this woman be? And how did the Empress find this out? Then Rihanna requested that the witness be brought in. The woman Rhea had bumped into in the city walked into the room. Elizabeth recognized her as her nanny. Then the Empress introduced the woman to the council, saying she was a midwife named Anna Brown from a traitorous family that was wiped from the face of the earth 23 years ago. And the queen consort's real name is Elizabeth Brown. Therefore, the queen consort has nothing to do with the prophecy. At that moment, Elizabeth shouted that the witness's testimony could be manipulated and demanded proof that she was not a Norden. Then Rihanna pointed to the existing evidence, a signet ring that once belonged to the Brown family and a diary left by Empress Liliana. In the Empress's palace, Rihanna had noticed that the wall was thin in a certain spot, so she decided to check it. Inside, the girl found a safe. It seemed Empress Liliana had deliberately created a hidden place that no one knew about. Then, with the Emperor's permission, Rihanna decided to read the contents of the diary. The book read as follows. Alexander is now 3 years old. His Majesty the Emperor, as if waiting for this very moment, is having an affair with a girl. I'm so sad I could die, but I must hold on because I need to protect my child. Unfortunately, I have no allies in this palace, so I've decided to keep the only person loyal to me by my side, my old friend, Mrs. Brown. Emperor Richard I and Duke Killen watched the two friends walk. Killen told the ruler that the woman with the Empress was Countess Brown, whom Liliana trusted completely and had made her lady-in-waiting. Richard commented that his wife was treating a nobleman's wife like a servant, and Killen reported that the noble's behavior was extremely suspicious. Furthermore, the Empress began spending a lot of time with Duke Brown. Then the man advised the emperor to put a stop to this suspicious connection, as it was damaging his image in the eyes of his subjects. After all, Richard was the son of the empire. Shortly after, Mrs. Brown was accused of treason. No matter how she tried to prove her innocence, the Empress was not allowed to do anything. She was forced to watch as the guards dragged her friend away. On that very day, the Brown family was wiped off the map. Later, Killen came before the Empress to offer his condolences. However, out of deep concern for Liliana, he decided to assign his sister to be her lady-in-waiting. Then the girl greeted the Empress, introducing herself as Rosalind Killen. Liliana gave the new handmaiden a fleeting smile and then asked to be left alone. She wanted to rest. As a final request, Duke Killian asked her to take good care of his sister. Rosalind was brought to Liliana's side as the new handmaiden, but the Empress paid her no mind, and Rosalind paid the Empress no mind either. Seeing the girl chatting sweetly with her husband, the Emperor, Liliana, found the whole thing disgusting. After some time, a man came to see the Empress. He reported that Mrs. Brown's daughter had survived. The man was Count Norden, and he said he had managed to save her. Then Liliana asked him to take care of the girl as if she were his own child, and when the time was right, she wanted to see her. The diary entry ended there, which could only mean that Her Majesty Empress Liliana passed away immediately after writing that passage. Thus, the two women of the Brown family, accused of treason, survived and escaped their fate with the help of the Norton family. When Elizabeth realized that Duke Killian had murdered her parents, she screamed because it wasn't enough for him to eliminate her family. Now he had decided to frame and use her as well. The Duke immediately yelled back at the girl, telling her to shut up. Then Liz said she also had something to say. The handmaiden Diana, who worked in the Queen Consort's palace, was the Duke's lackey. Furthermore, the Duke had forced her to attempt to assassinate the Emperor. Lisbeth also said she had proof that the poison needle was currently under His Majesty's bed, and if they investigated the source of the poison, all evidence would point to Killen. Alexander immediately sent guards to search for the needle. Soon, they found it and brought it to the council hall. Then the Emperor prepared to pass judgment on the two criminals on the spot. What happened to the Brown family was shocking, but it did not absolve Elizabeth Brown of the murder of Count Norton and the attempted assassination of Empress Rihanna Norton, not to mention her involvement in the attempt on the Emperor himself. Therefore, given the gravity of her crimes, Elizabeth Brown was sentenced to death to be carried out in 5 days. The girl immediately began to struggle and cry, begging the Emperor for mercy, saying she was just a victim, that she had been used. But the guards dragged the girl away, and then it was Killian's turn. He urged the man not to believe the words of that wicked girl, claiming he had been loyal to the Esterridge family his entire life. But Alexander didn't want to hear his excuses. He ordered the Duke to be thrown into the dungeon, where he would be executed alongside Elizabeth Brown in front of the entire empire. Killian shouted, pleading with the Emperor to think of Prince Albert, who would be left all alone in the palace without any family. Then Alexander gave him a dark look and ordered him to shut up, or he would be executed on the spot. Duke Killian tried to break free from the guard's hold, but to no avail. As a last resort, he yelled that he should have gotten rid of the Emperor long ago, and that the throne of this country belonged to Albert. After things had settled down, Alexander and Rihanna left the Great Hall. As they were walking down the corridor, Prince Albert ran up to them, claiming he had something to say to his older brother. The Emperor then said that he would not spare his uncle, that he should have done so long ago instead of letting things get this bad. But Prince Albert argued that it was not too late to make things right. The young man said that his brother could exile him right now. Alexander was surprised, not understanding what Albert was planning this time. But then the prince said that his purpose had been fulfilled, as he had remained in the palace until now only to protect the Emperor. He recalled a time in their childhood when he went to find his older brother. Back then, they met every day in that old cabin because his mother did not want him associating with his brother. But then something happened. The boys wanted to have some fun, and Albert suggested they play with swords. He said he had forgotten his sword there last time and immediately ran to get it. But at that very moment, the floorboards beneath his feet cracked, and he fell into a deep pit. Albert pleaded with his brother to save him, as he was utterly terrified. So Alexander promised to get him out and ran to the Empress for help. But no one came to rescue the child that day. Alexander couldn't believe it. He had told the Empress everything himself. As it turned out, they just told him someone was on their way to save Albert and then ordered him to bed. The boy wasn't rescued until the next morning. Afterwards, his mother, the Empress, summoned him. She lied, saying Alexander hadn't said a word, and that he hated his brother out of fear that he would usurp the throne. Rihanna couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rosalind had put her own son in danger just to ruin the brothers' relationship. Albert then said that this was why he started avoiding Alexander, but he eventually found out the truth. The Emperor then asked his younger brother why he hadn't said anything for so long, and why he had let him go on hating him. Albert said it was for the best, because Alexander had his uncle to deal with, had lost his own mother, and his life was also in danger. He felt that only hatred could help his brother cope with it all. He wanted to stay and protect Alexander, even if it was in this way. But now that it was all over, Albert wanted the Emperor to let him go. He didn't want to be tormented by guilt any longer, or else this kind of thing would only happen again and again. But Alexander forbade him from leaving the palace. He ordered Albert to stay and atone for his uncle's crimes. His younger brother had to remain and prove his loyalty to the crown, and only then would he forgive him. Shortly after, the execution of the criminals was carried out. When the people learned of Elizabeth's crimes, they were filled with immense anger. No one opposed the death sentence, and finally, it was all over. After everything that had happened, Rihanna and her husband were walking in the garden. Alexander said that now, Count Norden and his mother could finally rest in peace. He asked her why she hadn't gone to the execution with him, and Rihanna replied that the emperor needed some time alone, as he had been through too much in such a short time. Alex needed time to process the truth and forgive, and only then could he find inner peace. And so, he began to read his mother's diary, which recorded all her feelings for him, his first steps, and his first words. All the love Alexander received as a child was recorded in that diary. His mother had wanted him to become a man who could love with all his heart, not just a powerful emperor. Therefore, he wanted to follow the path she had wished for him. Then, the man said that although it was a bit late, he still wanted to give Rihanna his answer. He told her that he felt the same emotions with all his heart. He understood now that he truly loved Rihanna. Meanwhile, 2 years passed, and the royal couple was finally ready to go on their honeymoon. Margaret felt that, even for a king, this was a bit much. But Rihanna said that Alexander had been incredibly busy lately. Not to mention, there was a new addition to the family. Little Riel was also going on the trip with his parents. So, justice was served 2 years ago, and Rihanna and Alexander were still working on their extraordinary marriage.